My daughter always belittled me, completely unaware I owned the multinational company she worked for. At a formal dinner, she pushed me too far, and I casually stated, "I am the CEO." Her face went pale as the crushing truth hit her. She had been disrespecting the absolute wrong person. That silence spoke louder than words. My name is Howard Pierce. I am 69 years old, and what I'm about to share with you changed the power dynamic of my entire family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth. The phone rang on a bitter Tuesday afternoon. The caller ID displayed the name Kendra, my only daughter. We had not spoken a single word to each other in 8 long months. The last time we interacted in person, she had sharply criticized my worn leather boots at her mother Cynthia's memorial service, calling them an embarrassment. I answered the call foolishly, expecting a late apology or perhaps a rare moment of genuine connection. Instead, her voice came through the speaker, crisp, clinical, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. She abruptly informed me she was hosting a lavish housewarming party at her new suburban mansion that upcoming weekend. Before I could even process the invitation, she delivered her true message. She explicitly ordered me to park my old truck in the back alley behind the caterers. She stated clearly that my vehicle was a massive eyesore. She said she could not risk her elite corporate guests seeing such a rusty, embarrassing piece of junk parked anywhere near her pristine driveway. The sheer audacity of her demand hung heavily in the air. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or demand the respect a father deserves. I simply agreed to her terms and hung up the phone. She naturally assumed my silence was weak compliance. She assumed I was merely a retired, broken-down warehouse manager scraping by on a meager fixed pension, desperate and eager for any pathetic crumb of attention from his successful, high-flying daughter. She was entirely wrong. Saturday evening arrived with a biting, unforgiving chill. I sat quietly in the cold cab of my faded blue Ford pickup truck, gripping the worn leather steering wheel. The engine rumbled with a familiar, comforting, steady vibration. To Kendra, this truck was a humiliating symbol of blue-collar poverty and failure. She thoroughly despised its chipped paint, the manual roll-up windows, and the faded, tearing upholstery. She had spent her entire adult life running aggressively away from the working-class roots this truck perfectly represented. What my arrogant daughter did not know was the immense history permanently etched into this very dashboard. 40 years ago, I bought this exact truck secondhand with my last remaining dollars. It was the very first operating vehicle in what would eventually become the global fleet for Apex Logistics. I built a multi-million-dollar supply chain empire from the ground up, starting with a single grueling delivery route driven night after night in this rusted metal box. I grew Apex into a terrifying titan of industry, managing complex distribution networks across the globe. 10 years ago, right after my beloved Cynthia passed away, I made a highly calculated decision to step entirely back from the public eye. I transitioned my role to become the silent majority shareholder and the undercover chief executive officer. I desperately wanted to see how my daughter would navigate the ruthless corporate world, relying strictly on her own merit. I strategically positioned her as the director of transportation at Apex, stepping back into the shadows to let her believe she was climbing the corporate ladder through sheer brilliance and unparalleled skill. I intentionally maintained my incredibly modest lifestyle, choosing to live in my original small home and drive my original old truck. I wanted to run a profound psychological test on her character. I needed to see if money, corporate titles, and power would ultimately corrupt the fundamental values Cynthia and I had tried so hard to instill in her. Sitting in the freezing cab of the Ford, staring up at the towering, excessively lit silhouette of Kendra's new mansion, I finally had my definitive answer. She had become entirely obsessed with shallow appearances, fake status, and unearned wealth. The truck was simply a mirror reflecting her own deep vanity. I turned the ignition off, letting the heavy silence settle around me. I had hundreds of millions of dollars sitting untouched in diversified portfolios and secure trust funds. I personally owned the very company that enthusiastically signed her massive paychecks every 2 weeks, yet she treated me like a dirty, embarrassing secret that needed to be hidden away in a dark alley. I stepped out of the truck, the loose gravel crunching loudly under my heavy work boots. The night air was sharp and stinging, but my mind was entirely clear and focused. I was not walking up this driveway to celebrate a housewarming milestone. I was here to observe a hostile takeover of my own flesh and blood by pure, unadulterated greed. I walked steadily up the dimly lit side path, deliberately bypassing the long line of luxury European sports cars parked out front. I followed Kendra's explicit and insulting instructions to the letter, making my way directly to the rear of the sprawling property where the large catering vans were idling noisily. I approached the heavy oak service door near the kitchen entrance and knocked twice with a firm hand. The door swung open abruptly, revealing Bradley, my son-in-law. Bradley was a man in his late 30s who meticulously dressed like a successful Silicon Valley billionaire, but possessed the actual business acumen of a reckless, desperate gambler. He wore a tailored navy blazer and gripped a heavy crystal glass of expensive whiskey. His pale eyes swept over my thick flannel jacket and faded jeans with absolute undisguised contempt. He did not say hello. He did not invite me in from the freezing cold. Instead, he reached swiftly into his blazer pocket, pulled out a tightly folded piece of paper and shoved it directly and forcefully against my chest. He told me the catering staff was currently short-handed and instructed me to make myself useful to earn my keep for the night. He aggressively demanded I empty the overflowing trash bins, keep the stainless steel kitchen counters wiped down, and ensure the guest ice buckets remained completely full. Before I could even formulate a response, he leveled a sharp, threatening finger directly at my face. He explicitly forbade me from stepping a single foot inside the main living room. He stated his potential venture capital investors were currently mingling inside, and he absolutely could not have a dirty, unkempt old man wandering around ruining the high-class aesthetic of his event. He treated me not as his wife's father, but strictly as the disposable hired help. The absolute disrespect radiating from him was not an accidental slip of the tongue. It was a calculated, deliberate degradation meant to put me in my place. I looked down at the crumpled list of kitchen chores now resting in my calloused hand. I did not throw it back at his smug face. I did not raise my voice to passionately defend my bruised pride. Anger is a useless emotion reserved strictly for people who lack real control over their environment. I folded the piece of paper meticulously, sliding it deep into the front pocket of my heavy jacket. I stepped fully into the bright, bustling kitchen, silently watching the panicked catering staff scramble chaotically around me. The loud music and booming laughter from the main living room echoed sharply through the long marble hallway. Just as Bradley turned his back to head out and rejoin his wealthy investors, the heavy, swinging door burst open with incredible force. Kendra marched aggressively into the kitchen, her expensive designer silk dress rustling sharply against the counters. Her eyes locked instantly onto me, wide, intense, and completely frantic. She did not look remotely happy to see her father attending her party. She looked deeply panicked and cornered. She marched straight up to my chest, reached aggressively into my jacket pocket, and snatched the folded chore list right back out. She shot a furious, venomous glare at Bradley, then grabbed my forearm with a tight grip that physically dug into my skin. She told me to completely forget about the trash bins and the ice buckets. She ordered me to follow her into the main living room immediately. She made it perfectly painfully clear through her tense tone that I was not being invited out there to joyfully join the celebration, grab a warm drink, or mingle with her high society friends. She needed me standing in the main room right now for one highly specific, urgent reason. She needed me to sign a very important piece of paper. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut, severing the loud bass of the party music and the clinking of champagne glasses in an instant. The sudden silence in the room was thick, sterile, and suffocating. Kendra did not offer me a seat. She marched straight to the center of the room and stood beside a massive mahogany desk, her posture rigid and aggressively combative. Bradley followed closely behind me, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the plush Persian rug. He bypassed me completely, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with my daughter. They looked exactly like two corporate sharks preparing to devour a wounded animal. I remained standing near the doorway, keeping my calloused hands resting calmly inside the pockets of my faded work jacket. Bradley reached inside his tailored blazer and produced a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed the crisp papers onto the polished wood surface of the desk with a sharp, dismissive slap. He tapped his index finger against the bold, black letters printed at the very top of the page. It was a comprehensive property transfer agreement coupled with an absolute power of attorney. Kendra crossed her arms over her designer silk dress, her eyes cold and entirely devoid of any filial affection. She demanded I sign the documents immediately. She explicitly stated that Bradley's new software startup was currently hemorrhaging capital and facing an imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. They needed an immediate substantial injection of liquid cash to appease their angry venture capital investors before the entire company collapsed. They had independently decided that the most logical solution to their self-inflicted financial crisis was to liquidate my home. They wanted me to sign away the deed tonight so they could list the property on the real estate market by tomorrow morning. There was no discussion, no polite request for a family favor, and absolutely no respect. It was a direct, hostile demand masquerading as an unavoidable parental obligation. I looked down at the documents resting on the desk. My eyes instantly caught the printed address of the property they were so eager to strip away from me. It was the modest single-story house in the quiet, working-class neighborhood where I still lived. More importantly, it was the exact home Cynthia and I had purchased together over 4 decades ago. It was the only piece of real estate I had deliberately kept exclusively in her name for deeply sentimental reasons. After she passed away from a sudden illness 10 years ago, the title transferred to me, carrying the heavy, beautiful weight of her memory in every single brick, every window frame, and every wooden floorboard. I still tended the rose garden she had planted in the backyard. Now my own daughter was viewing her mother's sacred sanctuary as nothing more than a convenient piggy bank to fund a failing vanity project. I remained entirely silent, letting their arrogant assumptions fill the void in the room. My lack of immediate compliance deeply irritated Bradley. He quickly dropped his polished facade of the successful tech entrepreneur and let his true, ugly nature bleed through. He stepped forward, leaning his heavy weight against the desk, and began to list his justifications with absolute ruthlessness. He called me a dead weight, a severe financial burden dragging down their upward social mobility. He stated with sickening confidence that an old black man like me had no business occupying a highly valuable piece of real estate in a rapidly gentrifying zip code. He claimed I lacked the basic intellectual capacity to manage my own meager retirement savings, let alone understand the complexities of the current housing market or property taxes. He genuinely believed I was just an ignorant, worn-out laborer who had simply outlived his usefulness to society. He told me I should be eternally grateful that they were graciously willing to take the massive burden of homeownership off my fragile, aging shoulders. Kendra did not flinch at her husband's subtly racist and deeply ageist rhetoric. Instead, she nodded her head in full agreement. She coldly added that everything I had ever done to provide for her growing up was merely my basic biological duty, a duty that had long since expired the moment she graduated college. She told me to stop being a selfish old man and finally do something useful for her brilliant future. Bradley picked up a heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc pen from the desk organizer. He held it out toward me, a smug, victorious grin stretching across his pale face. He fully expected me to take the pen with a trembling hand, perhaps shed a few pathetic tears of defeat, and sign my entire life away to secure their fraudulent, debt-ridden lifestyle. I slowly pulled my right hand out of my jacket pocket. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us. The air in the room grew instantly tense with anticipation. I did not look at the legal documents. I looked directly into Kendra's eyes, searching deeply for any remaining trace of the little girl I had raised, the girl I had worked grueling night shifts in freezing warehouses to support. There was absolutely nothing left of her in the cold, calculating woman standing before me. I shifted my unwavering gaze to Bradley. Through the highly trained lens of a corporate chief executive officer, I evaluated them not as my beloved family, but as hostile amateur negotiators sitting across a boardroom table. They had aggressively shown their entire hand within the first 5 minutes. They were financially desperate, morally bankrupt, and operating under a catastrophic miscalculation of their own leverage. I reached out and took the gold pen from Bradley's fingers. His smug grin widened in anticipation of his easy victory. I held the pen loosely, feeling its cold metal weight. I spun it once smoothly and deliberately between my thumb and index finger. The tactile sensation grounded me firmly in the reality of the moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I placed the pen gently back onto the mahogany desk. It made a soft, definitive click against the hard wood. I looked Bradley dead in the eyes and delivered my final answer. No. I did not raise my voice to shout. I did not offer a single word of explanation, justification, or anger. I delivered a flat, absolute, and unyielding rejection. The single syllable hit the quiet room like a physical shockwave. Kendra gasped loudly, her eyes widening in genuine, unadulterated disbelief. She had never been told no in her entire privileged adult life, let alone by the man she considered her pathetic, subservient father. The sheer audacity of my refusal instantly shattered her carefully constructed reality. But it was Bradley who completely unraveled. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced rapidly by a mask of raw, explosive fury. He slammed both of his fists down onto the heavy mahogany desk with enough violent force to rattle the crystal glasses resting on a nearby display shelf. His face turned an angry shade of crimson. He leaned aggressively across the desk, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and mounting financial panic. He pointed a trembling finger mere inches from my face and unleashed his ultimate, devastating threat. He swore that if I did not sign the transfer agreement willingly tonight, he would drag me through the family court system by Monday morning. He proudly declared that they had already retained a ruthless team of aggressive lawyers to file an emergency petition for involuntary legal guardianship over my life. He did not stop there. With a terrifyingly casual tone, he revealed that they had already paid off a corrupt private physician to sign a fraudulent medical certificate declaring me severely incapacitated by advanced dementia. He promised to have me forcibly removed from my home by law enforcement, locked away in the cheapest state-run psychiatric facility they could find, and seize total control of all my assets through a finalized court order. They had orchestrated a complete malicious conspiracy to strip me of my human rights, my property, and my personal dignity. He sneered viciously, telling me that no judge in the state would ever believe the rambling stories of a confused, senile old man over the polished testimony of a successful corporate director and her wealthy husband. I looked at their furious, greedy faces, and a profound, icy calm settled permanently over my mind. This was no longer just a tragic case of a greedy daughter demanding an unearned financial handout to save face. This was a calculated criminal declaration of war against my freedom and my life. And they had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground they were standing on. I left the suffocating toxicity of Kendra and Bradley's suburban mansion long before dawn. The memory of Bradley's spit-laced threats regarding fake dementia diagnoses and forced legal guardianship fueled my drive back to the city. By 7 in the morning, I stood before the towering glass facade of the Apex Logistics global headquarters. The morning commuters rushing past the front revolving doors paid absolutely no attention to the older black man in the faded work jacket. They saw an aging laborer. They did not see the architect of the very skyline they walked under. I bypassed the bustling main lobby entirely and swiped a heavily encrypted biometric keycard at an unmarked steel door in the subterranean parking garage. The private chairman's elevator ascended smoothly, shooting up 50 floors in total silence. Stepping out onto the executive level, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The frantic, disrespectful noise of my daughter's housewarming party was replaced by the immaculate, soundproofed quiet of absolute corporate authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the shipping port where my cargo vessels moved billions of dollars in global trade. I shed the worn flannel jacket and draped it over a leather chair. I poured a cup of black coffee from the console, feeling the familiar weight of the executive suite ground my thoughts. Here I was not a burden. I was the undisputed king. Bradley had foolishly promised to strip me of my autonomy. He deeply misunderstood the battlefield. He thought we were fighting over a modest suburban home. He was entirely unaware that he had just declared war on a man who commanded an international supply chain. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the room and booted up the secure terminal. For the past 10 years, this heavily restricted interface had been my solitary window into the daily operations of Apex Logistics. When my wife Cynthia passed away a decade ago, the grief hollowed me out completely. She had been my moral compass, the gentle force that kept my fierce business ambitions grounded in family values. In her absence, I made a highly calculated decision to step away from the blinding glare of the public eye. I legally restructured the corporation, transitioning myself into a silent majority shareholder and an undercover chief executive officer. I appointed a public-facing board of directors who answered exclusively to me behind closed doors. I needed to run a profound, unvarnished test on my only daughter. Kendra possessed a sharp mind, but Cynthia had always worried about her growing sense of entitlement. I deliberately positioned Kendra as the director of transportation, placing her in charge of the most critical logistical arteries of the company. I gave her a generous 6-figure salary and a corner office on the 40th floor. Then I retreated into the shadows. I intentionally maintained my working-class lifestyle, continuing to live in the modest house Cynthia and I had bought 40 years prior. I drove the same rusted truck. I let Kendra believe I survived entirely on a fixed Social Security pension and a meager union retirement fund. I wanted to see if she would climb the corporate ladder through merit, hard work, and the ethical foundation we had tried to build for her. I needed to know if she would treat her aging, seemingly impoverished father with basic human dignity when she believed he had absolutely nothing left to offer her financially. The results of my decade-long psychological test were now agonizingly clear. Money and corporate prestige had completely corrupted her. She had not only failed the moral test as a daughter, but she was also currently utilizing her high-ranking position to demean the very man who secretly signed her paychecks. She firmly believed I was a senile, disposable old man ripe for legal exploitation. She thought my financial footprint was limited to a single residential deed and a dusty checking account. As I logged into the executive mainframe, I prepared to show her the true scale of the power she had so arrogantly insulted. The heavy oak doors to my office swung open with a soft mechanical hum. Jonathan, the chief legal counsel for Apex Logistics, and my most trusted ally, stepped into the room. He was a sharp, meticulous man who had helped me build the legal framework of this empire from its earliest days. He was one of the very few individuals on the planet who knew my true identity as the functioning CEO. Jonathan did not offer empty pleasantries or waste time with casual morning chatter. He walked directly to my desk carrying a thick, red-tabbed classified dossier. I did not wait for him to sit down. I issued a direct, non-negotiable executive order. I commanded him to initiate an immediate, hostile, and comprehensive forensic audit of the entire transportation department. I wanted every single ledger, every vendor contract, and every expense report approved by Director Kendra Pierce, scrutinized down to the last decimal point. I instructed him to bypass the standard internal accounting teams and utilize our top-tier external fraud investigators. I wanted her corporate emails pulled, her digital signature logs verified, and her departmental budgets frozen pending the results. If Kendra and her husband were desperate enough to risk federal elder abuse charges and medical forgery just to steal my modest residential home, they were financially drowning. And a financially drowning corporate director with unrestricted access to international shipping budgets was a massive liability to my company. I expected Jonathan to nod, take notes, and leave to execute the directive. Instead, his expression remained gravely serious. Jonathan placed the thick red dossier directly onto the center of my desk. He stated that he had already taken the liberty of running a preliminary financial sweep of the transportation department late last night. He had noticed highly irregular behavioral patterns in Kendra's recent vendor approvals and decided to pull the restricted data proactively. I opened the file and stared at the highlighted figures. The numbers were catastrophic. Kendra's department was currently bleeding from a massive $2 million budget deficit. The funds were not missing due to incompetence or standard logistical miscalculations. They were being systematically and deliberately siphoned out of the Apex corporate accounts. Jonathan pointed to a complex web of recent financial transactions. Kendra had been signing off on exorbitant recurring invoices for ghost operational costs. She was authorizing massive payments for phantom freight maintenance, non-existent consulting fees, and fabricated supply chain software upgrades. The money trail was heavily obscured, routed through multiple offshore payment processors, but Jonathan's team had successfully traced the final destination of the stolen capital. Every single fraudulent invoice eventually funneled directly into a series of newly registered shell companies. I looked at the executive summary page detailing the corporate ownership of those shell entities. The primary registered agent and sole financial beneficiary for every single one of them was Bradley. My daughter and my son-in-law were not just plotting to steal my house. They were actively embezzling millions of dollars from my corporation. The heavy silence of my executive suite was shattered by the sharp vibration of my private cell phone resting on the polished mahogany desk. I kept my eyes fixed on the forensic audit report Jonathan had just delivered, tracking the millions of dollars my daughter and her husband had systematically siphoned from my corporation. I picked up the phone. The caller ID displayed Kendra's name. I pressed the answer button and brought the device to my ear. There was no greeting. There was no hesitation. Kendra launched directly into a cold, calculated assault. She informed me that my stubbornness the previous night at her housewarming party was entirely unacceptable. She then delivered a rigid ultimatum. I had exactly 7 days to pack my belongings and vacate the house I had shared with Cynthia for 4 decades. She spoke to me not as a daughter addressing her father, but as a ruthless property developer evicting a delinquent tenant. She stated that Bradley had already contacted a liquidator. They planned to clear out my remaining furniture by the end of the following week to prep the house for an immediate cash sale. If I refused to hand over the keys and the deed voluntarily, she promised to involve local law enforcement. She threatened to send sheriff deputies to physically remove me from the premises. She claimed she had already spoken to legal counsel and assured me they possessed enough leverage to forcefully strip me of my residency. She warned me not to test her resolve. I listened to the sharp, commanding tone of her voice. She felt absolutely powerful. She believed she had cornered a helpless, uneducated old man who lacked the resources to fight back. She was digging her own grave with every arrogant syllable she uttered, completely unaware that she was speaking to the ultimate authority in her professional universe. Kendra did not stop at the eviction notice. She felt an overwhelming need to justify her cruelty, framing her unadulterated greed as a necessary step for her professional survival. She proudly announced that she was currently the top candidate for the vacant vice president position at Apex Logistics. She bragged about her impending promotion, completely oblivious to the fact that the final approval for that specific executive appointment sat inside a pending file on the very desk I was currently leaning against. She told me that securing the vice president seat required a flawless public image. She and Bradley needed a massive influx of liquid capital to maintain their luxurious lifestyle, host high-profile networking events, and impress the elite board members of the corporation. My modest residential house was the only remaining asset they could liquidate to cover Bradley's massive financial failures and fund her corporate ambitions. Then her voice hardened with profound disgust. She told me that my entire existence was a humiliating stain on her upward mobility. She explicitly brought up a memory from her childhood. She recalled the brutal winter of her 7th grade year when I walked her to the bus stop every morning. She remembered staring down at my heavy leather work boots. The soles were completely worn through, patched hastily with thick tape to keep the freezing snow out. I wore those ruined boots for 3 consecutive winters so I could afford the exorbitant tuition for her private mathematics tutor. I sacrificed my own basic physical comfort to ensure her brilliant mind had every possible educational advantage. Kendra did not view that memory as a testament to a father's unwavering devotion. She viewed it as a permanent, unforgivable embarrassment. She stated that she had spent her entire adult life trying to wash off the stench of my blue-collar poverty. She told me she could not risk her wealthy colleagues or the Apex Board of Directors discovering that her father was a destitute, stubborn old man living in a declining neighborhood. My continued presence in that house, my refusal to quietly disappear into the background, was an active threat to the elite aesthetic she had meticulously constructed. She demanded my total capitulation to serve her vanity. She wanted me to surrender the last physical remnant of her mother so she could buy the respect of strangers. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a predator who believes her prey is already dead. I absorbed every single venomous word without interrupting her monologue. I did not raise my voice to defend my past sacrifices. I did not remind her of the freezing warehouse shifts or the agonizing physical labor that built the foundation of her current arrogance. Arguing with a narcissist only validates their false sense of superiority. Instead, I employed the most devastating weapon in a corporate negotiator's arsenal. I offered her total, unconditional surrender. I kept my voice incredibly soft, injecting a slight trembling hesitation into my tone to perfectly mimic the defeated old man she desperately needed me to be. I told her that I finally understood her position. I admitted that I was tired of fighting and that I did not want to cause any more trouble for her career. I agreed to sign over the deed to the house. I suggested we meet at my local bank branch next Monday morning to finalize the property transfer and handle the necessary financial authorizations. The sudden shift in my demeanor caught her off guard for a mere second before her immense ego swallowed the bait entirely. Kendra let out a sharp, victorious sigh of relief. Her tone instantly shifted from aggressive hostility to sickeningly sweet condescension. She praised me for finally being reasonable and acting in the best interest of the family. She promised that she and Bradley would handle all the complicated legal paperwork so I would not have to strain my aging mind. She told me to bring my identification and wait for them in the lobby. She hung up the phone, fully convinced she had just successfully bullied her father into surrendering his entire life's work. She believed she had won the war without shedding a single drop of blood. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the polished mahogany surface. The quiet hum of the climate control system filled the vast executive suite. I looked across the desk at Jonathan. My chief legal counsel had stood in absolute silence, expertly reading the shift in my posture. He knew the 10-year psychological test was definitively over. The time for passive observation had officially ended. I slid the red forensic audit file across the desk toward him. I instructed Jonathan to bypass the standard corporate disciplinary procedures. I ordered him to draft a comprehensive suite of hostile takeover documents targeting every single shell company Bradley had registered. Through his gross incompetence, Bradley had used Apex Logistics vendor contracts to fund those entities, legally tangling his stolen assets with my corporate infrastructure. I commanded Jonathan to weaponize that oversight using every aggressive corporate clawback provision available under federal law. I wanted total legal authority over those accounts primed, verified, and ready for my signature before the weekend was over. I was going to let Kendra and Bradley walk into that local bank branch believing they were about to steal my home and fund their lavish future. They would leave that building completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their corporate standing, and their false dignity. The trap was meticulously set, the jaws wide open, waiting only for them to confidently step onto the trigger next Monday morning. The metallic click of the front door tumbler turning broke the absolute silence of my morning. I sat at the kitchen island, a mug of black coffee resting in my hands, fully aware that I had not given anyone permission to enter my home. Heavy, arrogant footsteps echoed down the hardwood hallway. Bradley strode into my living room, a thick, leather-bound clipboard tucked aggressively under his arm. He did not bother to ring the doorbell or announce his sudden arrival. He simply used the emergency spare key Kendra had demanded from me years ago, under the false pretense of checking on my health. Close behind him walked a younger man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit, clutching a digital tablet and a laser measuring device. Bradley walked right past the kitchen threshold, his pale eyes sweeping over my property with the cold, detached hunger of a vulture circling a dying animal. He completely ignored my physical presence in the room. He treated me as if I were a transparent ghost, haunting a space that no longer belonged to me. He immediately began pointing at my furniture, dictating estimated liquidation values to the silent appraiser trailing him. He priced my solid mahogany dining table at a pathetic $500. He dismissed the genuine leather armchairs as outdated junk worth barely $50. He paraded through my living space, reducing my entire 4 decades of existence into a rapid-fire, low-budget clearance sale. I remained perfectly still on my stool, observing this blatant home invasion with the calculated scrutiny of a corporate executive evaluating a massive security breach. Bradley felt completely untouchable this morning. He falsely assumed his impending court petition for guardianship gave him premature, unchecked dominion over my property and my life. He aggressively ordered the appraiser to measure the exact square footage of the master bedroom, totally disregarding the legal fact that the rightful owner of the estate was sitting less than 15 feet away. He wanted to intimidate me to show me that my sanctuary had already been conquered and my personal boundaries no longer existed. The appraiser moved quickly toward the hallway to measure the dimensions while Bradley turned his arrogant attention to the large brick fireplace dominating the center of the living room. My eyes instantly locked onto his hands. He reached up to the wooden mantel and grabbed the heavy brass carriage clock resting perfectly in the center. His greasy fingers smeared the meticulously polished metal. He lifted it carelessly, flipping it upside down to inspect the maker's mark etched into the bottom base. He barked an order to the appraiser across the room, telling him to add another $200 to the liquidation list. That clock was not a random piece of decorative merchandise. It was the absolute last anniversary gift my wife Cynthia had purchased for me before her heart failed a decade ago. She had spent months quietly tracking down that specific 19th century timepiece through private antique dealers because I had once casually mentioned admiring it during our first year of marriage. It was a sacred artifact of my life with her. Every single tick of its intricate brass gears served as a constant reminder of the incredible woman who had built my moral foundation. Bradley held the clock, loosely dangling it by its fragile top handle as if it were a cheap disposable trinket salvaged from a neighborhood garage sale. The deep, calculated calm I had maintained since the disastrous housewarming party instantly evaporated. I stood up from the kitchen stool, crossing the living room in 3 wide, purposeful strides. I did not shout, but my voice carried the absolute unyielding weight of a man heavily accustomed to total corporate obedience. I ordered him to put the clock back on the mantel exactly where he found it. My tone left zero room for negotiation or debate. The appraiser froze in the hallway, lowering his digital tablet with a look of sudden panic. Bradley stopped mid-sentence, turning to face me with an expression of profound annoyance and blatant disrespect. He scoffed loudly, clutching the brass clock even tighter against his chest, as an act of petty defiance. He sharply reminded me that everything inside this house was about to be forcibly liquidated to cover my upcoming psychiatric care and his crucial business investments. He stated clearly that I had permanently lost the right to be sentimental about material objects. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance until I was standing mere inches from his smug, entitled face. I repeated my demand, lowering my voice to a dangerous, gravelly register. I told him he had exactly 3 seconds to return my deceased wife's property to the mantel before I physically removed it from his hands. Bradley's arrogant smirk morphed instantly into a terrifying mask of sudden explosive rage. He slammed the delicate brass clock down onto the hard brick hearth with a sickening metallic thud. Before I could even drop my gaze to check the timepiece for permanent damage, he lunged forward. He grabbed the thick fabric of my shirt collar with both of his clenched fists. He used his heavier body weight and younger momentum to shove me violently backward across the room. My shoulder blades slammed incredibly hard against the oak-paneled wall of the living room, forcefully knocking the breath from my aging lungs. The appraiser gasped aloud and took a quick, frightened step toward the front door, clearly wanting absolutely no part in a violent physical altercation. Bradley pressed his thick forearm hard against my chest, pinning me firmly in place against the wood. His face was flushed an angry, violent red, his rapid breath hot and reeking of stale coffee. He unleashed a horrific barrage of vicious, racially charged insults directly into my face. He called me an ignorant, stubborn old black thug who simply did not know his proper subordinate place in the modern world. He stated with sickening conviction that wealthy, educated white men like him were the ones who actually controlled society, while uneducated laborers like me existed solely to be exploited, drained of resources, and immediately discarded. He hissed through his teeth that my corporate daughter was deeply ashamed of my dark skin and my lingering blue-collar stench. He aggressively ordered me to stop playing the tough guy and immediately accept my miserable, impoverished fate. He warned me that if I made the bank transfer difficult on Monday morning, he would personally ensure my final years were spent locked inside a windowless padded room, heavily medicated, and strapped to a hospital bed. He wanted to break my spirit completely. He wanted to instill a deep, paralyzing fear that would force me into absolute submission. Bradley abruptly released his tight grip on my collar with a final violent shove, letting me slide slightly against the rough wood paneling. He took a step back, breathing heavily, and straightened the lapels of his tailored navy blazer. He aggressively adjusted his expensive cufflinks, attempting to regain his false veneer of high-class sophistication. He shot a glaring, threatening look at the terrified appraiser and signaled for the man to leave the premises immediately. They marched rapidly down the hallway without uttering another word. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, the loud impact echoing sharply through the suddenly empty house. I remained leaning quietly against the wall for several long seconds, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart and calm the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I carefully smoothed out the wrinkled fabric of my shirt. I did not feel an ounce of fear, intimidation, or defeat. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of total victory. I slowly shifted my gaze upward, looking directly at the small plastic casing of the smoke detector mounted high in the corner of the living room ceiling. Securely hidden inside that innocuous plastic casing was a microscopic, high-definition, motion-activated security camera. I had explicitly ordered my elite corporate security team from Apex Logistics to covertly install 4 identical surveillance devices throughout the house late last night. Every single second of Bradley's unauthorized home invasion, his attempted theft of Cynthia's clock, his vile racist vitriol, and his unprovoked physical assault had been captured in flawless, crystal-clear audio and video. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket and opened the private security application. The screen displayed a bright green confirmation checkmark. The heavily encrypted video file had already automatically uploaded to Jonathan's secure legal server at the Apex headquarters. Bradley firmly believed he had just successfully dominated a helpless, senile old man through brute physical force and racial intimidation. In reality, he had just willingly handed me the exact, undeniable felony evidence required to send him directly to a federal penitentiary. The metallic click of the front door tumbler settling into place broke the heavy silence of my living room. I remained standing perfectly still against the oak-paneled wall where Bradley had violently shoved me just moments before. The digital confirmation of his unprovoked assault was already secured within the encrypted servers of Apex Logistics. I slowly smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my faded flannel jacket, feeling a profound, icy calm anchor my mind. The time for passive observation had officially expired. My son-in-law believed he had just dominated a weak, defenseless old man through brute physical intimidation. He was completely unaware that he had willingly handed me the exact felony evidence required to destroy his entire life. Before I could even step away from the wall, the sharp, jarring ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of the house. It was not my secured executive device. It was my standard everyday phone, the one tied to my working-class cover identity. The caller ID displayed the name William Vance. William was the senior branch manager of the small community bank located exactly 4 blocks from my house. I answered the call immediately. William did not offer his usual warm, neighborly greeting. His voice was remarkably tight, strained, with a heavy layer of professional anxiety and deep personal concern. He informed me that a highly irregular, aggressive transaction had just been initiated against my primary financial accounts. Less than 15 minutes ago, a woman identifying herself as my daughter, Kendra Pierce, had faxed over a stack of expedited legal forms to the bank. She had explicitly requested the immediate total liquidation of my checking and savings accounts. She aggressively demanded that the entire balance of the funds be wire transferred directly into a newly established joint account registered exclusively under her and Bradley's names. I listened in absolute silence as William outlined the exact dollar amount Kendra was attempting to steal: $60,000. I kept this specific local account active for a highly deliberate and sentimental reason. It was the original joint account Cynthia and I had opened together 40 years ago when we first purchased this modest suburban home. I used this specific account exclusively to pay my monthly property taxes, cover basic utility bills, and purchase everyday groceries. It served as the flawless financial anchor to my carefully constructed working-class cover story. To the elite board of directors operating at the highest levels of Apex Logistics, $60,000 was an insignificant rounding error on a routine corporate expenditure report. To Kendra, however, that exact number represented the absolute sum of my entire existence. She had undoubtedly rummaged through my stolen personal mail, found those specific bank statements, and made a devastatingly ignorant calculation regarding my net worth. She looked at that $60,000 and saw a pathetic, failed old man. She saw a lifetime of grueling warehouse labor reduced to a figure that could barely cover the luxury upgrades on one of Bradley's leased European sports cars. Her insatiable greed and blinding arrogance had completely warped her reality. She was willing to risk committing a severe federal crime to steal literal pennies from a man she falsely believed was entirely destitute. She had evaluated my total value based on a single isolated checking account, completely unaware of the hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in diversified, heavily guarded portfolios just beyond her narrow field of vision. She viewed my lifetime of sacrifice as nothing more than a convenient temporary cash injection to keep her husband's failing vanity projects afloat. I instructed William to immediately transmit a secure digital copy of the documents Kendra had submitted to the bank. A soft ping from my encrypted tablet signaled the arrival of the files. I opened the high-resolution scans and studied them with the cold, detached precision of a corporate forensic auditor. The first document was a comprehensive financial power of attorney. I scrolled down to the final page of the legal contract. There, resting awkwardly on the designated signature line, was my name. It was a clumsy, pathetic forgery. The loops of the letters were visibly shaky, completely lacking the definitive heavy pressure of my actual handwriting. Kendra had clearly traced it, likely rushing through the criminal act in her desperate scramble for liquid capital. The sheer audacity of the forged signature ignited a slow, freezing anger deep within my chest. But the second document attached to the file was the true devastating weapon in her arsenal. It was a stamped medical evaluation originating from a highly exclusive private psychiatric clinic located in the wealthiest district of the city. I read the physician's clinical notes carefully. The document, signed by a doctor I had never met in my entire 69 years of life, officially diagnosed me with rapid onset advanced dementia. The fabricated medical report declared me prone to violent, irrational outbursts. It stated I was completely detached from reality and legally incompetent to manage my own financial or personal affairs. Kendra and Bradley had deliberately bypassed the standard family court system entirely. They knew a legitimate legal battle would require actual evidence. Instead, they had used their stolen corporate funds to purchase a fraudulent medical diagnosis from a corrupt physician. They intended to execute a swift, silent financial execution. They planned to drain my life savings by the end of the business day, leaving me completely penniless, legally defenseless, and entirely at their mercy before I even realized the theft had occurred. William waited anxiously on the other end of the line. He asked for my immediate authorization to freeze the account entirely to prevent the transfer. He offered to contact the local police department on my behalf and file a formal fraud report against my daughter right now. I stopped him immediately. A standard fraud charge handled by local authorities was merely a minor inconvenience for people with their level of corporate access. It would not permanently dismantle the empire of lies and stolen capital Kendra and Bradley had built. I needed them to face a public, undeniable reckoning that they could not manipulate their way out of. I instructed William to play along with their criminal scheme. I told him to deliberately stall the wire transfer using standard banking procedures. I ordered him to call Kendra back and adopt an apologetic, heavily bureaucratic tone. William was to explain that a mandatory internal security protocol had flagged the transaction due to the unusually large withdrawal amount. He must insist that the bank's strict compliance regulations required a physical, in-person verification to legally release the funds. William had to make it absolutely clear that both Kendra and Bradley needed to arrive at the main teller counter precisely at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to finalize the paperwork and clear the security hold. I assured William that I took full responsibility for this directive and promised him that his branch would not suffer any financial liability. The local bank manager agreed to the plan, his voice steadying as he finally understood the gravity of the trap being set. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Kendra and Bradley would spend tonight celebrating their perceived victory over an old, foolish man. They would walk through those heavy glass doors tomorrow morning completely convinced they were about to walk away with my home and my money. They were eagerly stepping directly onto the trigger of a trap that would sever their corporate lifeline forever. The polished marble floors of the downtown financial district bank reflected the harsh, early morning sunlight. I arrived exactly 20 minutes before the heavy glass doors officially opened to the general public. William Vance, the senior branch manager, had personally unlocked the discreet side entrance for me. He guided me directly to the secluded VIP waiting area located just beside the main teller stations. I sat down in a high-backed leather chair and rested my calloused hands comfortably on the curved armrests. I deliberately wore the exact same faded flannel jacket, worn denim jeans, and heavy work boots from the night before. I needed my physical appearance to perfectly match the fabricated narrative of the helpless, impoverished old man my daughter had meticulously constructed. I was utilizing my working-class history as camouflage. Precisely at 9 o'clock, the main entrance locks clicked open. Kendra and Bradley stormed into the quiet lobby with the chaotic, aggressive energy of people who genuinely believed they owned the building. Bradley wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit projecting the false image of a wealthy tech entrepreneur. Kendra carried an expensive designer handbag she had undoubtedly purchased using embezzled corporate funds from Apex Logistics. They completely bypassed the standard queue of morning customers and marched directly to the premier service desk. Kendra slapped a thick leather folder onto the counter. She loudly demanded the immediate release of the $60,000 from my checking account. She commanded the teller to expedite the wire transfer into her joint account, aggressively citing her forged medical power of attorney as absolute legal authority. The teller, following William's strict prior instructions, feigned a complex system delay and politely asked them to wait. Frustrated by the lack of immediate obedience, Bradley turned around to scan the lobby. His arrogant gaze swept past the waiting area, then snapped back with sudden, jarring recognition. He grabbed Kendra's arm tightly, physically pulling her attention away from the desk. They both froze instantly. The aggressive, entitled momentum drained completely from their posture as they stared at me sitting quietly in the corner. I did not wave. I did not utter a single word of greeting. I simply met their panicked stares with an unyielding, icy calm. The initial shock on Kendra's face evaporated in less than 3 seconds. It was rapidly replaced by a vicious, highly defensive rage. Instead of realizing the severe legal danger she was currently standing in, her massive ego forced her to double down on her criminal charade. She stomped across the marble floor toward me, her high heels echoing sharply like gunshots in the cavernous room. Bradley followed closely behind, looking nervously around to gauge the reaction of the other patrons and the armed security guards. Kendra did not lower her voice to preserve our privacy. She deliberately amplified her tone, weaponizing her fabricated victimhood to control the narrative of the entire room. She looked down at me and loudly demanded to know how I had managed to wander out of my house without supervision. She turned slightly to address the growing crowd of onlookers, sighing dramatically to perform the role of a deeply exhausted, overburdened daughter. She loudly proclaimed to the silent lobby that her father was suffering from severe advanced dementia and had tragically lost all touch with reality. She declared that I frequently became hostile, confused, and prone to violent outbursts. She painted a pathetic picture, claiming she was currently forced to undertake the agonizing legal burden of liquidating my meager life savings just to afford my necessary round-the-clock psychiatric care. She pointed a manicured finger at my faded jacket, calling me a stubborn, delusional old black man who refused to accept his own rapid mental decline. Her racist and ageist undertones were thinly veiled behind a mask of performative, daughterly distress. Every word she spoke was a calculated strike designed to humiliate me into absolute submission while simultaneously validating her forged medical documents to the bank staff. I remained perfectly seated, allowing the sheer weight of her public tirade to fill the room. I evaluated her performance through the cold, detached lens of a corporate executive dealing with a rogue, desperate employee. She firmly believed that the sum total of my financial worth resided entirely within the $60,000 she was currently attempting to steal. To Kendra, my entire legacy was permanently confined to that single modest checking account and a rusted pickup truck. She could not possibly fathom the reality that the man sitting quietly in the worn jacket possessed enough liquid capital to purchase the entire banking franchise outright. She evaluated my silence as a definitive sign of cognitive failure and physical surrender. Bradley stepped forward, crossing his arms aggressively over his chest, adding his own layer of physical intimidation to the spectacle. He told me to stop embarrassing myself in public. He ordered me to get up and follow them quietly to the manager's office so they could finalize the transfer without any further disruptions. They thought public shame would break my resolve. They believed the scrutinizing eyes of the bank tellers and security personnel would force me to quietly accept my forced institutionalization. They were busy digging a massive, inescapable trench of criminal liability, and I was merely handing them the shovels. I did not offer a single word of defense against her blatant slander. I let her finish her entire venomous monologue, waiting patiently for the final piece of the trap to spring into action. The heavy mahogany door to the executive suite swung open with a definitive sharp click, instantly cutting through the lingering echo of Kendra's insults. William Vance stepped out into the main lobby. As the senior branch manager, William commanded immediate respect from the entire staff. He wore an immaculate navy suit and carried a sleek digital tablet in his right hand. Kendra immediately pivoted away from me, snapping her fingers to demand his full attention. She marched aggressively toward him, brandishing her fraudulent medical certificate and the forged power of attorney documents. She loudly insisted that William override the teller's system delay and process the transfer of my funds into Bradley's account right that very second. William did not slow his pace. He completely ignored Kendra's outstretched hand and bypassed her entirely as if she were an invisible obstruction on the floor. He walked straight across the marble tiles and stopped directly in front of my chair. To the absolute astonishment of my daughter, her husband, and every single patron watching the scene unfold, the senior branch manager bowed his head in a gesture of profound, unfeigned deference. He addressed me not as a confused elderly customer, but with the specific, highly guarded title reserved exclusively for his most elite financial clients. He formally welcomed me to the branch and politely asked if I required the private boardroom to conduct my morning business. The entire lobby plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. The tellers stopped typing on their keyboards. The security guards stood rigidly at attention. The false reality Kendra had just spent 5 minutes screaming into existence shattered instantly against the hard floor. I slowly stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my faded jacket with deliberate precision. I looked past William's shoulder to witness the catastrophic realization finally dawning on my daughter's pale face. Kendra stared at William, her jaw trembling slightly as her brain violently rejected the scene playing out before her. She stammered aggressively, demanding to know why the branch manager was treating a senile, broke old man with such high-level executive reverence. William finally turned to face her. The professional warmth he had just shown me was instantly replaced by a cold, hardened glare. He spoke with absolute merciless clarity that carried across the quiet room. He announced to Kendra and Bradley that my personal checking account was perfectly secure, fully operational, and completely devoid of any internal security flags. He stated definitively that the system delay at the teller counter had absolutely nothing to do with my funds or my mental capacity. William tapped the screen of his digital tablet and delivered the lethal blow. He informed them that the massive security lockdown was actually triggered by an emergency federal mandate originating directly from the Department of Justice. At precisely 8 o'clock this morning, federal investigators had officially frozen every single personal business and joint account registered to Kendra and Bradley. William explicitly stated that their assets were currently seized under an active high-level federal investigation for corporate embezzlement and international money laundering. The blood drained instantly from Bradley's face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. His arrogant posture completely collapsed. The trap I had carefully set over the weekend had slammed shut with bone-crushing force, severing their financial lifelines entirely. The total seizure of their financial assets triggered a visceral, desperate reaction from Kendra and Bradley. They were abruptly cut off from the stolen corporate capital funding their lavish lifestyle and were now functioning strictly on sheer panic. The federal freeze essentially trapped them inside a rapidly burning building of their own creation. Without access to their heavily padded checking accounts, they could no longer sustain the elite facade they had so arrogantly paraded in front of me. Their immediate response was not to seek competent legal counsel to defend against the impending federal embezzlement charges. Instead, they foolishly chose to double down on their original malicious strategy against me. They believed that if they could swiftly execute their fraudulent guardianship plan, they might gain unrestricted access to the funds holding my property and somehow utilize those assets to negotiate a settlement or hire a high-profile criminal defense team. Less than 48 hours after the disastrous confrontation at the bank, I was formally served with an emergency petition filed in the county family court. Kendra had officially submitted a legal request to have me involuntarily committed to a secure psychiatric facility. She aggressively petitioned the judge to grant her immediate absolute control over my entire estate, arguing that I posed an imminent physical danger to myself and others. They hired a notoriously aggressive law firm known for bulldozing through family court proceedings, utilizing the last remnants of their available credit to secure a hefty retainer. They were operating like wounded animals backed into a corner, lashing out with everything they had left in a desperate attempt to survive. To bolster their fabricated narrative of my severe mental decline, Kendra and Bradley introduced a highly manipulated piece of audio evidence to the family court judge. They submitted a carefully edited sound file capturing the intense confrontation in my living room when Bradley had attempted to steal Cynthia's brass clock. The audio completely omitted Bradley's violent physical assault and his vile racist tirade. It excluded his aggressive threats to lock me inside a padded room. The recording began exactly at the moment I raised my voice, firmly ordering him to return my deceased wife's property and vacate my home. To an objective listener lacking the full context, the isolated audio clip painted a highly disturbing picture. It sounded exactly like an unhinged, deeply paranoid older man screaming irrationally at a family member who was merely trying to assist him. Kendra's legal team expertly weaponized this edited recording, presenting it as definitive, undeniable proof of my advancing dementia and violent instability. They coupled this manipulated audio with the fraudulent medical certificate they had purchased from the corrupt private physician. They wove a compelling, tragic narrative of a successful, loving daughter forced to make an agonizing legal decision to protect her violently deteriorating father. They bet everything on the assumption that I would react to the court summons with the exact type of defensive, emotional outrage they could easily categorize as further proof of my mental incompetence. They fully expected me to scramble for a local defense attorney and engage in a messy, protracted legal battle within the county court system, a battle they believed they could win through sheer attrition and manufactured evidence. I completely bypassed the local family court arena. I did not waste my time or resources hiring a regional defense attorney to argue against a fabricated audio file. I recognized that engaging in a defensive posture only lent credibility to their malicious accusations. Instead, I boarded a private flight out of the city the very next morning. I traveled directly to the National Institute of Mental Health. This was the premier psychiatric research facility in the country, staffed by the most elite neurologists and cognitive specialists available. I did not seek a simple consultation or a routine checkup. I voluntarily submitted myself to a rigorous, exhaustive battery of independent cognitive assessments. Over the course of 3 grueling days, I underwent comprehensive neurological imaging, extensive psychological profiling, and complex logical reasoning examinations. I requested that 3 separate, highly distinguished specialists evaluate my mental capacity completely independent of one another. I wanted an ironclad, unassailable medical record establishing my absolute cognitive clarity. The specialist did not evaluate me based on the biased testimony of a greedy daughter. They evaluated the raw clinical data of my brain function. The rigorous testing process completely dismantled the fabricated narrative Kendra had so desperately tried to sell to the family court judge. The results were not simply a confirmation of basic competency, they were a definitive medical endorsement of an exceptionally sharp, highly functional executive mind. The final certified medical reports arrived securely bound and heavily notarized by the chief of neurology at the National Institute. The comprehensive data explicitly detailed my flawless memory retention, my exceptional problem-solving capabilities, and my absolute mastery over my own executive functions. The medical consensus was unanimous and undeniable. I was completely devoid of any neurological degradation or psychiatric instability. I immediately instructed Jonathan to submit these certified national medical records directly to the presiding family court judge, alongside the unedited full-length security footage capturing Bradley's violent assault in my living room. The devastating contrast between Kendra's fabricated evidence and the indisputable national medical data completely destroyed her legal petition in an instant. The judge reviewed the files and immediately recognized the massive scope of the deception. The fraudulent medical certificate Kendra had purchased from the private physician was instantly reclassified. It was no longer viewed as evidence of my decline. It became the primary exhibit proving a severe criminal conspiracy to commit perjury and elder exploitation. The family court judge did not merely dismiss Kendra's petition for guardianship. He formally referred the entire docket, including the edited audio file and the forged medical documents, directly to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal prosecution. Kendra had attempted to use the legal system to cage me. Instead, she had successfully handed the state prosecutor all the necessary evidence to begin drafting her own arrest warrant. The criminal investigation by the district attorney was moving silently beneath the surface of the city like a subterranean fault line ready to crack the earth wide open. Unaware of the impending legal avalanche that was rapidly preparing to crush their entire existence, Kendra and Bradley pressed forward with their blind ambition. They operated under the foolish assumption that their stolen wealth and fabricated status made them entirely untouchable. Bypassing the severe financial crisis looming over their shell companies, Kendra hosted a wildly extravagant gala at the Grand Solstice Hotel. On paper, the heavily publicized event was billed as a philanthropic fundraiser for urban development programs. In reality, it was a meticulously orchestrated political campaign. Kendra was aggressively lobbying the Apex Logistics Board of Directors to secure the vacant vice president seat. She rented out the prestigious Diamond Ballroom, hired a Michelin-starred catering team, and flooded the guest list with the most influential corporate titans in the region. The sheer arrogance of throwing a $250,000 party while actively under a covert federal investigation for money laundering perfectly illustrated her absolute detachment from reality. She firmly believed an executive promotion would grant her the ultimate institutional shield against any potential legal repercussions. She thought corporate power was an impenetrable fortress that could protect her from the consequences of her own actions. She sent me a formal gold leaf invitation. The heavy envelope arrived via certified mail, a highly calculated legal maneuver designed to document her supposed daughterly devotion for any future court hearings regarding my mental capacity. She fully expected me to arrive at the gala in my faded flannel jacket and worn work boots. She desperately needed me to stumble into that glittering ballroom looking exactly like a destitute, confused old man. My pathetic appearance was meant to serve as the ultimate visual aid for her fabricated tragedy. She wanted the elite crowd to whisper in sympathetic tones about the brilliant young executive carrying the agonizing burden of a senile, unmanageable black father. She intended to harvest their pity and transform it directly into executive votes. But her cruelty extended far beyond the invitation itself. Walking up the sweeping marble steps of the Grand Solstice Hotel brought a heavy, suffocating wave of grief crashing against my chest. This was not just a random luxury venue selected for its high-end aesthetics. This was the exact location Cynthia had carefully chosen for our 30th wedding anniversary. We had spent months looking at glossy brochures at our kitchen table, saving every extra dollar to make it happen. My late wife had always dreamed of wearing a sweeping silver gown and dancing under the massive crystal chandeliers of the Diamond Ballroom. She passed away 4 months before we could even mail the invitations. Kendra knew this detail intimately. She knew the immense emotional weight this specific building carried for me. She deliberately weaponized her mother's unrealized dream, using the venue as a psychological dagger to keep me off balance and deeply uncomfortable. She wanted me to feel utterly out of place, haunted by painful memories, and completely submissive to her authority. It was a vile tactic designed to strip away my confidence before I even walked through the doors. I did not give her the satisfaction of my suffering. I refused to play the role of the broken victim in her theatrical production. I bypassed the standard formal wear rental shops and opened a sealed garment bag I had kept safely stored in my closet for years. I arrived at the grand entrance wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray bespoke suit I had commissioned from a master tailor in London a decade ago. It was not merely clothing, it was the armor of a chief executive officer. The heavy wool fabric fell perfectly across my shoulders, projecting absolute authority and uncompromising power. I adjusted my silk tie and walked past the valet stand. As I stepped through the gilded double doors, the ambient noise of the party washed over me. The massive room was a sea of expensive fabric, sparkling diamonds, and the hollow sound of forced corporate networking. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. The string quartet playing in the corner was completely drowned out by the aggressive chatter of people trying to prove their net worth to one another. I navigated through the dense crowd with the slow, deliberate pacing of a predator surveying its territory. I scanned the room and spotted Bradley almost immediately near the premium open bar. He was holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch, aggressively cornering a small group of distinguished older men. He was frantically pitching a highly inflated investment opportunity, desperately trying to siphon legitimate venture capital into his failing network of shell companies. His hand gestures were overly animated, betraying the severe financial panic hiding just beneath his tailored tuxedo. He spotted me approaching from the corner of his eye, and his arrogant smirk widened into a malicious grin. He stepped away from his captive audience and intercepted my path, intentionally blocking my way forward. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my suit, and loudly mocked my attire. He sarcastically asked if I had robbed a discount thrift store to find a jacket that almost fit my aging frame. He purposefully raised his voice to ensure the wealthy investors standing behind him heard every single degrading word. He told me the catering entrance was in the back alley where I belonged. He suggested I grab a silver tray of appetizers to make myself useful to the real guests of honor, instead of wandering around ruining the aesthetic of his wife's important night. He sought to humiliate me to assert his dominance in an environment he falsely believed he controlled. Bradley puffed out his chest, utterly thrilled with his own cruel performance. He took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the burn of the alcohol fuel his false bravery. He gestured expansively to the distinguished men standing silently behind him, proudly announcing that he was currently engaging in high-level financial discussions with the senior executive board of Apex Logistics. He warned me not to humiliate Kendra in front of the very people actively evaluating her for the vice president position. He demanded I stay completely out of sight, remain silent, and find a dark corner to sit in until the event concluded. The sheer magnitude of his ignorance was almost beautiful to witness. It was a spectacular display of unearned confidence built entirely on a foundation of lies. Bradley had absolutely no idea who he was actually talking to. He did not realize that the distinguished men holding their cocktail glasses were not his potential investors. They were my direct subordinates. Every single board member in that tight circle had reported exclusively to me in secure, highly classified executive briefings for the past 10 years. They knew the exact sound of my voice when I ordered massive global supply chain restructuring. They knew the precise heavy weight of my signature on international shipping contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They did not look at Bradley with admiration, respect, or genuine business interest. They looked at him with profound, silent pity. They recognized the bespoke charcoal suit I wore. They understood the exact dangerous shift in my posture as I squared my shoulders. The board members stopped swirling their drinks. They stood rigidly at attention, holding their breath, their eyes locked firmly on my face. They completely ignored the arrogant fool rambling in front of them about software acquisitions and profit margins. The tension in the diamond ballroom thickened into a suffocating, palpable force that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the air. The executives waited in absolute disciplined silence for my final devastating signal to begin the corporate execution. The sharp ringing chime of a silver spoon tapping repeatedly against a crystal champagne flute cut through the low, ambient murmur of the diamond ballroom. Kendra stepped confidently up to the raised acrylic podium, her posture radiating an unearned sense of absolute superiority. She was bathed instantly in the harsh, brilliant glow of a solitary overhead spotlight. She wore a stunning emerald silk gown, an extravagant garment purchased entirely with funds she had systematically embezzled from my corporation. She grasped the smooth edges of the podium, leaned intimately into the microphone, and began to weave a masterful, highly calculated tapestry of absolute lies. She spoke to the crowd of wealthy investors and corporate elites with a rehearsed theatrical passion about the grueling nature of the corporate climb. She boldly claimed the prestigious title of a self-made woman who had dragged herself out of a stagnant, uninspiring background by sheer unparalleled force of will. She painted a vivid, highly fabricated picture of a childhood defined by severe limitations and a crushing lack of vision. She explicitly described growing up under the roof of a man who possessed absolutely no drive, no ambition, and no understanding of true financial success. She characterized her father as a complacent, weak-minded laborer, perfectly content to waste his entire life in dead-end warehouse jobs, completely incapable of providing anything beyond bare-minimum survival. She told the captivated audience that she was forced to teach herself the fundamental principles of leadership and wealth generation, because her own home was a sterile, suffocating wasteland of mediocrity. Every single word she spoke was a calculated, venomous strike designed to elevate her own social status by publicly burying my legacy in the dirt. She was deliberately using my supposed failures as the sturdy stepping stones for her ultimate corporate triumph. She firmly believed she was currently delivering the defining victorious speech of her entire career, cementing her inevitable promotion to vice president. As she reached the carefully orchestrated emotional climax of her fabricated origin story, Kendra deliberately shifted her gaze away from the center of the crowded room. She looked directly toward the dimly lit, marginalized corner table where she had intentionally assigned me to sit. Her eyes locked onto mine through the vast space. Her expression was completely devoid of any daughterly warmth or basic human respect. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, mixed with a sickeningly victorious arrogance. She wanted to ensure I heard every single degrading word clearly. She desperately wanted to watch my spirit break in real time under the crushing, undeniable weight of public humiliation. She fully expected me to shrink down into my seat, a defeated, impoverished old man completely overwhelmed by the glitz and glamour of a wealthy world I allegedly did not belong in. She automatically assumed the elite crowd would follow her gaze, look at my faded exterior, and immediately flood her with sympathetic admiration for overcoming such a pathetic patriarch. However, the physical reaction of the room did not align with her narcissistic, self-serving script. The highest-ranking directors, senior vice presidents, and key stakeholders of Apex Logistics occupied the premium circular tables directly surrounding the base of the stage. These were the exact men and women she desperately needed to impress to secure her promotion. They did not nod their heads in sympathetic agreement. They did not offer polite, encouraging applause. Instead, they instantly recognized the man sitting silently in the shadows. They recognized the impeccable, distinct cut of the charcoal gray bespoke suit I wore. They understood the absolute terrifying danger radiating from my quiet, unmoving posture. In a display of chilling, synchronized corporate discipline, every single senior executive at those premium tables slowly lowered their crystal champagne flutes. They placed their expensive glasses down onto the white linen tablecloths in perfect, unbroken unison. The delicate clinking of glass against the tables ceased entirely. The ambient noise of the ballroom died a sudden, unnatural death. The atmosphere in the room thickened immediately into a dense, suffocating wall of tension. The air grew so incredibly heavy it felt difficult to pull into the lungs. The executives sat rigidly upright, their faces wiped completely blank, their eyes fixed intently on me, waiting silently for a command. Kendra stood at the podium, her confident smile beginning to falter slightly at the edges. She interpreted this terrifying absolute silence as profound awe at her storytelling. She was completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that she was currently standing at ground zero of an impending corporate detonation. I placed my calloused hands flat against the table and pushed myself up from the chair. I rose to my full height, squaring my shoulders to bear the immense weight of the authority I had kept carefully hidden for 10 long years. Every single pair of eyes in the massive ballroom instantly snapped toward my position. The silence was so absolute, so heavy, that the rhythmic, measured sound of my leather dress shoes clicking against the polished marble floor echoed loudly off the high gilded ceilings. I stepped out of the shadows and began my deliberate, unhurried walk toward the brightly lit stage. The dense sea of wealthy investors, local socialites, and ambitious corporate climbers parted automatically. They stepped back in synchronized waves, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me, instinctively responding to the sheer, uncompromising gravity of my presence. Kendra watched my steady approach from behind the clear, acrylic podium. Her eyes widened rapidly with a sudden, confusing flash of panic. This specific variable was not part of her meticulously crafted plan. The impoverished, broken-down old man was not supposed to stand up and challenge her narrative. He was not supposed to stride effortlessly through a room of millionaires with the steady, unyielding confidence of an apex predator. She shot a frantic, desperate look toward the uniformed security personnel heavily flanking the stage doors, silently but aggressively demanding they intervene and remove the disruption immediately. The guards did not twitch a single muscle. They did not take a step forward to protect her. They had already received their strict, non-negotiable operational directives directly from Jonathan's internal security chief hours before the gala began. I reached the base of the stage and walked smoothly up the short flight of carpeted steps without breaking my stride. I stepped fully into the harsh, blinding glare of the spotlight towering over my daughter's shrinking frame. The smug arrogance had completely vanished from her face, replaced by a pale, trembling terror that she could no longer mask. She opened her mouth to speak, to issue a command, or perhaps to hurl another venomous insult to save face, but her voice completely failed her. I stood directly in front of her, feeling no pity for the panic radiating from her eyes. I reached out with a steady, unwavering hand and gently but firmly wrapped my fingers around the sleek metal base of the microphone. I pulled it smoothly and deliberately out of her rigid grasp. She offered absolutely no physical resistance. She was entirely paralyzed by the sheer, incomprehensible reality of the moment unfolding before her. I turned my back to my daughter, dismissing her existence entirely, and faced the breathless, silent audience filling the grand ballroom. I looked down directly at the premium tables where my senior executive board remained seated in rigid, unwavering attention. I did not need to shout to capture the room. I did not let a single ounce of anger, bitterness, or emotion bleed into my voice. I projected my words with the cold, surgical precision of a commanding officer addressing his troops on the eve of a battle. Thank you, Director Kendra, for that highly imaginative and deeply educational presentation. I stated, my voice echoing powerfully and clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It is always a fascinating experience to hear the creative fiction our department heads invent to entertain their esteemed guests. However, it is time to firmly ground this evening back in absolute reality. Allow me to properly introduce myself to those of you who have not yet had the distinct privilege of attending a closed-door executive briefing. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the immense, crushing weight of the silence stretch tightly across the massive diamond ballroom. I am Howard Pierce. I am the chairman of the board, the active chief executive officer, and the sole owner holding 80% of the controlling shares of Apex Logistics Corporation. The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavy enough to crush bone. The ambient hum of the diamond ballroom ceased to exist, replaced by the collective suspended breath of 300 corporate elites. Kendra stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium. Her eyes darted wildly, searching the vast expanse of the room for a punchline to a joke she fundamentally failed to understand. The blood had entirely drained from her face, leaving her skin a chalky, terrified gray. Yet her towering narcissistic ego refused to accept the catastrophic reality unfolding before her. She gripped the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Instead of surrendering, she desperately deployed the very lie she had constructed to steal my home. She forced a harsh, shrill laugh that echoed unnaturally through the silent hall. She reached frantically for the secondary microphone resting on the lower shelf of the stand. She gripped it with a trembling hand and addressed the bewildered audience, plastering a sickeningly sweet, apologetic smile across her face. She announced in a loud, patronizing tone that she was deeply sorry for the sudden interruption. She boldly lied to the entire room, claiming that her beloved father was currently suffering from a severe documented psychiatric episode. She doubled down on the fabricated dementia diagnosis, stating that my delusions of grandeur were a tragic symptom of my rapid mental decline. She raised her hand and sharply snapped her fingers toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. She aggressively ordered the uniformed hotel security guards to step forward, immediately demanding they physically restrain me and escort me off the premises before I could cause any further embarrassment to her corporate event. She genuinely believed her manufactured narrative was strong enough to overwrite the commanding presence I had just established. She waited for the guards to rush the stage, fully expecting to watch her father be dragged away in disgrace. Not a single security guard moved a muscle. The men stationed at the perimeter of the ballroom remained planted firmly in their positions, their hands clasped neatly behind their backs. They did not take orders from a mid-level transportation director. They took their operational directives exclusively from the Apex Logistics Executive Security Detail, a detail that answered only to me. Kendra's desperate, commanding snap faded into the suffocating quiet. She snapped her fingers a second time, her voice cracking with mounting panic, demanding compliance from the hotel staff. The absolute rejection of her authority hung in the air like a physical weight. Then the true hierarchy of the room asserted itself. At the premium circular tables situated directly beneath the stage, the Apex Logistics Board of Directors initiated their response. These were the highly influential men and women Kendra had spent the last 4 hours desperately courting with expensive champagne and fabricated stories of her self-made success. They did not look at her with pity or understanding. They looked at her with profound, unyielding disdain. In perfect synchronized unison, the 12 most powerful executives in the corporation pushed back their chairs and stood up. They did not murmur among themselves. They did not question my identity. They turned their bodies away from Kendra and faced me directly. With absolute practiced reverence, they bowed their heads in a uniform gesture of deep professional respect. The chairman of the finance committee, a man Kendra had practically begged for a mentorship meeting earlier that evening, explicitly addressed me as Mr. CEO. The impact of that single, highly respectful acknowledgement struck Kendra with the force of a freight train. Her jaw locked rigidly in place. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the acrylic podium. Her entire psychological framework, built meticulously upon a foundation of perceived racial and generational superiority over her working-class father, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The devastating truth bypassed her denial and took root directly in her consciousness. The man she had mocked for wearing worn leather boots, the man she had tried to illegally evict from his own home, the man she had planned to lock inside a psychiatric ward for a mere $60,000, was the undisputed architect of the empire she worshipped. She realized in that agonizing extended moment that she had never climbed the corporate ladder through her own unparalleled brilliance. I had built the ladder, owned the building it leaned against, and allowed her to climb it purely as a test of her character. A test she had failed with spectacular criminal cruelty. Her breath hitched in her throat as the suffocating gravity of her massive miscalculation pinned her to the stage. She was not a rising corporate star fighting off a delusional parent. She was a petty thief who had unknowingly attempted to rob the master of the house while standing in his own living room. The heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a definitive booming crash. The sudden noise whipped the attention of the crowd toward the back of the hall. Jonathan, my chief legal counsel, marched down the center aisle with the relentless, unyielding pace of an executioner. He was flanked tightly by 4 members of the Apex Logistics internal security team. These were not standard hotel guards hired to check invitations. These were highly trained corporate investigators wearing tailored black suits and earpieces, professionals specializing in white-collar extraction and asset protection. They moved in a flawless diamond formation around Jonathan, securing the perimeter of the stage within seconds. The wealthy guests and local socialites stepped back rapidly, their self-importance evaporating in the face of genuine structured corporate force. Jonathan did not spare a single glance for the bewildered crowd. He walked directly up the short flight of stairs and joined me on the brightly lit stage. His expression was a mask of cold, legal absolute. He carried the thick, red-tabbed forensic audit dossier in his left hand. He approached the acrylic podium where Kendra stood entirely paralyzed by fear. He did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge her presence as a human being. Jonathan simply lifted the heavy dossier and dropped it directly onto the podium, right over the meticulously typed notes of her arrogant speech. The thick stack of paper hit the plastic surface with a sharp, heavy slap. The bright red confidential tabs stuck out like warning sirens. The dossier contained every single forged invoice, every fabricated routing number, and the complete financial blueprint of the $2 million she had systematically embezzled into Bradley's shell companies. The undeniable documented proof of her felony crimes now rested mere inches from her trembling hands. I looked down at my daughter. There was no paternal warmth left in my eyes, only the sterile, uncompromising judgment of a betrayed chief executive. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring my voice carried clearly to every corner of the massive diamond ballroom. I addressed the room with absolute chilling authority. I formally announced that effective immediately, Kendra Pierce was permanently terminated from her position as Director of Transportation at Apex Logistics. I explicitly stated the cause of termination was gross corporate negligence, severe financial misconduct, and the direct embezzlement of company funds. The collective gasp from the audience was instantaneous. The pristine, untouchable image Kendra had spent hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars to cultivate was publicly and brutally incinerated. I turned my head slightly and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the lead security officer standing at the edge of the stage. The officer stepped forward swiftly. He reached out and professionally but forcefully unclipped the gold-plated executive access badge pinned to the silk fabric of Kendra's designer gown. The physical removal of her corporate identity broke whatever fragile thread was keeping her standing upright. Kendra stumbled backward in sheer, unadulterated panic. Her high heel caught the edge of the thick stage carpeting. She lost her balance completely and crashed heavily into the small cocktail table positioned behind the podium. A tall, crystal champagne flute tipped over upon impact. The expensive, sparkling wine cascaded down, soaking instantly into the delicate emerald silk of her gown. She stood there, drenched, stripped of her title, and publicly branded a thief in front of the most powerful people in the city. The trap had closed perfectly, but the execution was not yet complete. The physical collapse of Kendra sent a massive shockwave through her husband. Bradley witnessed his carefully constructed world of stolen wealth disintegrating in real time. Instead of recognizing the insurmountable power dynamic that had just shifted against him, his sheer arrogance fueled a deeply foolish reaction. He abandoned his polished facade of a sophisticated tech entrepreneur. His face contorted into a mask of raw, primal rage. He lunged forward from the edge of the crowd, his hands balled into tight fists, aiming directly for my position on the stage. He intended to use physical violence to salvage his shattered pride and defend his humiliated wife. He barely crossed 3 feet of the marble floor before the Apex Logistics internal security detail intercepted him. These professionals did not hesitate or negotiate. 2 men in tailored black suits moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. The lead officer grabbed Bradley by his expensive lapels, utilizing the younger man's own momentum against him. With a swift, calculated pivot, the officer swept Bradley completely off his feet. The second guard clamped a vice-like grip on Bradley's shoulder and drove his body forcefully downward. The heavy thud of Bradley's chest slamming against the nearest catering table echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. Silver cutlery and crystal glasses clattered to the floor, shattering into sharp fragments as the guards pinned him face down against the white linen tablecloth. His cheek was pressed hard against the wood, completely neutralizing his pathetic display of aggression. He thrashed wildly, his expensive dress shoes slipping uselessly on the polished marble, but the security personnel held him with absolute immovable force. I watched his futile struggle from the podium without flinching. He looked exactly like a cornered rat trapped under a heavy boot. He had previously pushed me against a wall when he thought no one was watching. Now he was physically neutralized in front of the most powerful people in the city. With the physical threat instantly removed, Jonathan stepped forward to execute the financial destruction. My chief legal counsel retrieved a small black remote from his suit pocket and aimed it toward the ceiling. The massive high-definition projector screen, originally rigged to display Kendra's vanity presentation, unrolled slowly behind the stage. The bright white light flooded the room, illuminating the faces of the corporate elite. Jonathan pressed a single button and a complex, highly detailed forensic financial graph materialized on the enormous screen. The visual evidence was absolute and uncompromising. The graph meticulously tracked the exact flow of the $2 million Kendra had systematically drained from the Apex Transportation Department over the previous 8 months. Thick red lines connected the approved corporate invoices directly to the fabricated vendor accounts. From there, the digital trail branched out, revealing a labyrinth of offshore payment processors designed to obscure the theft. But the Apex internal auditors had torn through those digital walls with brutal efficiency. The arrows on the screen consolidated, pointing like glaring neon signs to a dozen newly registered shell companies. The bold text at the bottom of the screen listed the primary registered agent and sole financial beneficiary for every single fraudulent entity. The name Bradley was projected in massive black letters for the entire ballroom to witness. This was the exact money Bradley had been desperately trying to legitimize all evening. For the past hour, he had been aggressively cornering my senior executives and wealthy venture capitalists, pitching them on his brilliant new software startup. He had sold them a narrative of explosive growth and groundbreaking technology. He had failed to mention that the initial seed capital keeping his fraudulent operation afloat was entirely stolen from the very corporation hosting this event. The numbers on the screen left no room for denial or creative accounting. Every illegal transfer, every fabricated maintenance fee, and every ghost consulting invoice was laid bare. The audience stared at the undeniable mathematical proof of a massive corporate embezzlement scheme orchestrated by the woman crying on the floor and the man currently pinned against the catering table. They had used my company as their personal bank, utterly convinced I lacked the basic intelligence to track my own ledger. The reaction from the crowd was swift, cold, and utterly brutal. The wealthy investors, local socialites, and senior executives whom Bradley had been desperately courting just moments ago initiated a synchronized physical retreat. They took several distinct steps backward, actively increasing the distance between themselves and the man pinned to the table. They looked down at him with expressions of profound disgust, staring at him as if he were a highly contagious pathogen. In the ruthless ecosystem of high-level corporate finance, there is no sin greater than stealing from your own house. The men who had politely nodded at his pitches earlier now turned their backs to him completely. The influential board members who Kendra had spent hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars to impress stared at the projected screen with cold, calculating judgment. Their elite social standing, the pristine reputations they had meticulously built upon a foundation of my stolen money, were completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. No respectable financial institution would ever grant them a loan. No venture capitalist would ever accept their calls or review their portfolios. No exclusive country club would ever approve their membership applications. They were permanently marked as radioactive liabilities in the business world. I watched the realization wash over Bradley's flushed face as he strained his neck against the guard's grip to see the shifting crowd. The people he worshipped were actively discarding him like garbage. He opened his mouth to shout a desperate defense, to loudly claim the documents were falsified or manipulated, but his words died in his throat under the overwhelming, crushing weight of the projected evidence. The social execution was absolute, public, and completely irreversible. They were permanently stripped of their false royalty and exposed as common thieves. I did not intend to conclude the evening merely with corporate termination and social exile. I required a permanent structural destruction of the threat they posed to my legacy and my freedom. I stepped back to the center of the podium and gripped the cold metal microphone. My voice carried a lethal, freezing calm across the expansive, dead-silent ballroom. I informed my daughter and her husband that my actions tonight did not end with human resources documentation or internal corporate audits. I announced clearly to the silent audience that the comprehensive forensic dossier Jonathan held was no longer an internal company secret. I explicitly stated that our legal team had already formally submitted the entire unredacted file, complete with the traced offshore routing numbers and the forged medical guardianship petitions, directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I informed them that the authorities possessed undeniable proof of wire fraud, grand larceny, and criminal conspiracy. The legal jaws had officially snapped shut. They were no longer facing a simple civil lawsuit for breach of contract or a quiet corporate dismissal. They were now the primary targets of a massive multi-agency federal criminal probe. I watched the final remnants of hope drain completely from Kendra's tear-stained face as the undeniable reality of federal prisons settled permanently into her mind. The distant wail of police sirens pierced the suffocating silence of the Diamond Ballroom. The sound grew rapidly, transforming from a faint hum in the city streets into an overwhelming, deafening roar right outside the Grand Solstice Hotel. Harsh flashes of red and blue light cut aggressively through the darkness outside, painting the massive floor-to-ceiling windows with the unmistakable colors of law enforcement. The rotating emergency lights cast long, erratic shadows across the crystal chandeliers, and the terrified faces of the corporate elite gathered in the room. Nobody moved a single inch. The entire audience remained frozen in place, captivated by the spectacular destruction of my daughter and her husband. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, which Jonathan and the security team had just walked through, burst wide open once again. This time it was not corporate security entering the hall. A highly coordinated tactical squad of uniformed police officers and plainclothes federal agents marched into the luxurious space. Their heavy tactical boots stomped loudly against the polished marble floor, completely shattering the refined, arrogant atmosphere of the gala. They moved with absolute uncompromising authority, forming a direct aggressive line straight toward the stage where Kendra stood paralyzed and toward the catering table where Bradley remained firmly pinned down by my men. The illusion of safety and privilege that Kendra had purchased with my stolen corporate money vanished instantly. The fortress of wealth she believed would protect her from the consequences of her actions was actively being breached by the reality of the criminal justice system. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his silver badge gleaming sharply under the harsh stage spotlight. He did not care about the Michelin-starred catering or the designer gowns surrounding him. He represented the absolute edge of the legal trap I had meticulously set. He looked directly at Kendra, who was still dripping with spilled champagne, and then cast a cold glance at Bradley, who was struggling weakly against the grip of the Apex security detail. The agent unfolded a thick legal document and began reading the official arrest warrants in a loud, booming voice that echoed off the gilded walls of the ballroom. He formally charged Kendra Pierce and her husband with multiple federal counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and international money laundering. He systematically listed the federal statutes they had violated by embezzling $2 million from Apex Logistics. But the agent did not stop at the financial crimes. He explicitly announced additional severe felony charges for conspiracy to commit elder fraud and the malicious forgery of federal medical documents. He revealed to the entire room that they had illegally purchased a fake psychiatric evaluation to forcefully strip me of my human rights. The brutal reality of their crimes was laid bare for every single investor, board member, and socialite to hear. There was no longer any corporate shield to hide behind. The elite facade they had spent months building completely disintegrated. They were no longer viewed as a rising executive star and a brilliant tech entrepreneur. They were instantly reduced to common, desperate criminals. The wealthy guests instinctively recoiled, physically backing away from the stage as if Kendra and Bradley carried a highly lethal disease. The very people my daughter had desperately tried to impress now looked at her with profound disgust and absolute contempt. Her expensive emerald silk dress, soaked in wine and clinging awkwardly to her trembling frame, suddenly looked like a pathetic, tragic costume. Bradley, previously so eager to pitch his fraudulent tech startup to the billionaires in the room, now kept his face buried deeply against the white linen tablecloth. He was utterly humiliated by the public reading of his criminal indictments, fully realizing that his social and financial existence was permanently eradicated. The sheer weight of the federal charges finally broke Kendra completely. Her towering narcissistic ego collapsed under the crushing gravity of an impending prison sentence. She dropped to her knees right there on the raised stage, ignoring the sharp pain as her bare knees slammed heavily against the hardwood floor. The woman who had proudly mocked my worn work boots and ordered me to park in a dark alley now crawled pathetically across the carpet toward me. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and grabbed tightly onto the fabric of my tailored trousers. She wept uncontrollably, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She abandoned all logic and resorted to the basest form of emotional manipulation. She sobbed violently, begging me to call off the federal agents and withdraw the criminal complaint. She screamed that we were flesh and blood, arguing that family was supposed to protect each other through any terrible mistake. She deliberately ignored the fact that her mistake was a calculated, sustained effort to destroy my life. When her frantic appeals to my fatherly duty failed to change the cold, sterile expression on my face, she shamelessly invoked the memory of my late wife. She cried out that Cynthia would never have wanted to see her only daughter locked away in a federal penitentiary. She weaponized her dead mother's name, using the woman whose sacred home she had just tried to steal as a desperate shield against the severe consequences of her own actions. She pleaded with me to remember the little girl I used to walk to the bus stop begging for a second chance, promising she would return every single stolen cent if I just made the police go away. Her performance was a sickening display of selfish desperation. She was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for betraying her father. She was crying exclusively because she had been caught and the punishment was finally real. I looked down at the weeping woman clutching my legs. I felt absolutely no pity, no warmth, and no desire to rescue her from the fire she had started. I deliberately stepped backward, pulling my leg away with a sharp, forceful motion that physically broke her desperate grip. She slumped forward onto the stage, her hands grasping uselessly at empty air. I stared down at her and delivered my final response with a voice as cold and hard as solid ice. I told her that my forgiveness had been officially priced the exact moment she paid a corrupt doctor for a fake psychiatric evaluation to lock me inside an asylum. The lead federal agent stepped forward immediately, interpreting my physical withdrawal as the final definitive signal to proceed. He grabbed Kendra by her arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. Across the room, 2 police officers hauled Bradley up from the catering table, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists with equal unyielding force. The authorities forcefully marched them down the center aisle of the Diamond Ballroom. They paraded my daughter and my son-in-law directly through the dense crowd of Apex board members, wealthy investors, and local elites. Every single person they had tried to manipulate watched their humiliating perp walk in absolute judging silence. The heavy double doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate and cementing the absolute destruction of their arrogant empire. The flashing red and blue lights outside illuminated their final exit, leaving the ballroom in a state of profound, undeniable order. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the Central Police Precinct offered no shadows to hide within. I stood quietly inside the darkened observation room alongside Jonathan. We were looking through the thick glass of a one-way mirror directly into a sterile interrogation chamber. The glamorous illusion of the grand ballroom had been entirely stripped away. Kendra and Bradley sat across from each other at a scarred metal table. The designer emerald silk gown my daughter wore was now stained and deeply wrinkled. Bradley looked completely unraveled. His expensive tailored suit jacket had been confiscated. He sat aggressively hunched forward in his wrinkled dress shirt. They had been placed in the same holding room temporarily while the detectives processed their initial intake paperwork. The recording devices mounted in the ceiling captured every single labored breath and frantic whisper. The pristine image of a powerful executive power couple did not survive the short ride in the back of the police cruiser. It evaporated the very second the heavy steel door locked behind them. They were no longer the arrogant elites who believed they could manipulate the world with stolen money. They were terrified suspects rapidly realizing the sheer magnitude of the federal trap they had stepped into. I watched my own flesh and blood with the cold and clinical detachment of a corporate chairman reviewing a catastrophic liability. There was no fatherly instinct urging me to break the glass and comfort her. She had willingly forfeited my protection the moment she priced my freedom at the cost of a forged psychiatric evaluation. The profound silence in the interrogation room fractured when Bradley slammed his palms against the metal table. Panic had completely overridden his sense of loyalty. He leaned across the narrow space and pointed a trembling finger directly at Kendra. He hissed that he was not going to take the fall for a medical forgery he did not physically sign. He explicitly stated that she was the one who tracked down the corrupt physician. He told her that making the fake medical power of attorney and faking my signature on the bank documents was entirely her grand design. He was actively attempting to secure his own legal immunity by aggressively throwing his wife directly to the wolves. Kendra did not recoil or seek the protection of her husband. She bared her teeth and retaliated with equal venom. She raised her voice, the microphone catching the raw desperation in her throat. She fired back that Bradley was the sole architect behind the fraudulent shell companies. She reminded him forcefully that he was the one who engineered the fake vendor contracts to siphon the $2 million out of the Apex Transportation Department. She screamed that she only signed the authorization forms because he had begged her to save his failing tech startup from absolute bankruptcy. Their marriage had always been a shallow transaction built on mutual greed and a shared obsession with social climbing. Now, under the terrifying weight of federal indictments, that hollow union was actively imploding. They were viciously tearing each other apart, frantically scrambling over one another to secure a hypothetical plea deal. I listened to their toxic accusations bouncing off the concrete walls. I thought about Cynthia and the unwavering devotion we had shared during the hardest, most impoverished years of our lives. My daughter had learned absolutely nothing from her mother. She had chosen a partner who mirrored her own moral bankruptcy. Watching them destroy each other saved me the trouble of doing it myself. The heavy door of the interrogation room swung open. A sharply dressed defense attorney marched in with a leather briefcase. He had been retained using the absolute last shred of their available credit before the federal freeze took total effect. The attorney immediately instructed his clients to remain completely silent. He stepped out of the holding room and moved briskly down the hallway toward the precinct captain and the district attorney. Jonathan and I stepped out of the observation room to quietly monitor the exchange. The defense attorney launched into a highly aggressive, practiced monologue. He demanded the immediate release of his clients. He categorized the entire situation as a massive corporate misunderstanding wrapped in a regrettable family dispute. He argued fiercely that Kendra and Bradley were upstanding members of the community, prominent business leaders with deep ties to the city. He insisted they posed zero flight risk and absolutely no physical threat to society. He formally requested that they be processed for standard white-collar infractions and released on a reasonable bail bond before sunrise. He was utilizing every standard legal tactic to ensure they could sleep in their luxurious suburban mansion tonight and prepare their defense from a position of comfort. For a brief moment, the confident posture of the defense attorney seemed to stabilize the chaotic energy in the hallway. Bradley peered through the small glass window of the holding room door, a faint glimmer of arrogant hope returning to his pale face. He genuinely believed that his expensive legal representation was about to seamlessly erase the consequences of his actions. He still fundamentally misunderstood the man who had orchestrated his downfall. Jonathan did not allow the defense attorney to finish his arrogant demands. My chief legal counsel stepped smoothly into the center of the hallway. He did not engage in a loud debate or offer a passionate counter-argument. He simply reached inside his tailored suit jacket and produced a secured digital storage drive. He handed it directly to the lead prosecutor standing beside the precinct captain. Jonathan spoke with a chilling, authoritative calm. He informed the prosecutor that the drive contained unedited, time-stamped, high-definition security footage captured inside my private residence just 48 hours ago. He stated that the video explicitly documented an unprovoked, violent home invasion. The prosecutor immediately plugged the drive into a nearby terminal. The video played clearly on the screen. The footage showed Bradley aggressively grabbing an elderly black man by the collar, shoving him violently against a wooden wall and hurling vile racial slurs. It captured the exact moment Bradley physically threatened to lock a key witness inside a psychiatric ward to silence him. The atmosphere in the precinct hallway shifted instantly. The slick defense attorney stopped talking, his confident expression crumbling into silent horror as he watched his client commit a violent felony on crystal-clear video. The legal paradigm was permanently altered in that single fraction of a second. This was no longer a complex, easily negotiated white-collar embezzlement case. It was a documented incident of violent elder abuse, severe physical assault, and explicit witness intimidation. The prosecutor ejected the drive and turned to the defense attorney with an expression of absolute resolve. He stated that the severity of the violent threats against a primary witness elevated the risk profile of the suspects to an unacceptable level. The prosecutor immediately approached the on-call magistrate to formalize the updated charges. The magistrate reviewed the evidence and issued a swift, irrevocable ruling. The request for bail was completely denied. Kendra and Bradley were officially classified as an active danger to the victim and an extreme flight risk. They would not be returning to their mansion. They would be remanded into state custody, locked inside a concrete cell, awaiting a federal trial they had absolutely no hope of winning. I watched the heavily armed transport officers step into the holding room to process them for maximum security lockup. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind them with a resounding, permanent echo. I stood tall in the precinct corridor as the officers escorted my daughter and her husband toward the processing area. Kendra caught a final glimpse of me standing calmly beside Jonathan. Her eyes were hollow, completely stripped of the arrogant pride she had wielded like a weapon just hours before. The realization that she had systematically destroyed her own life for a fraction of a fortune she was already set to inherit finally broke her spirit. She had tried to put a price tag on my dignity using a forged medical document. She learned too late that my silence was never a symptom of weakness. It was the calculated patience of a man giving his enemies enough rope to hang themselves. I turned my back on the holding cells and walked steadily toward the precinct exit. The crisp night air greeted me as I stepped out into the city streets. I had successfully excised a severe infection from my life and my corporation. The surgical removal was brutal, but the resulting clarity was undeniable. 6 agonizing months of complex legal maneuvering culminated inside the austere walls of the federal courthouse. The heavy mahogany panels and harsh fluorescent lighting offered absolutely no comfort, projecting only the cold promise of absolute judgment. I sat rigidly in the witness stand, dressed in the exact same charcoal gray bespoke suit I wore the night I dismantled my daughter's fraudulent empire. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. saturated with the anxious whispers of attending journalists and the nervous shifting of the opposing legal team. Kendra and Bradley sat at the defendant's table looking entirely diminished. Their expensive country club tans had completely faded into the sickly, hollow pallor of prolonged incarceration. When the presiding federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel, the trial officially commenced. The highly paid, aggressive defense attorney representing Kendra did not open his remarks with an apology or a plea for judicial leniency. He immediately went on the offensive. He pivoted sharply on his expensive Italian leather shoes, turning his back to the jury box, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me. He completely bypassed the undeniable documented evidence of corporate embezzlement and medical forgery, choosing instead to launch a vicious theatrical character assassination. His strategy was a desperate high-stakes gamble. He intended to put my parenting, my corporate secrecy, and my fundamental moral integrity on trial. He raised his voice, ensuring his baseless accusations echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. He declared that the true villain of this tragedy was not the weeping woman sitting at the defense table, but the stoic, manipulative titan of industry, observing the spectacle from the witness box. He framed the entire criminal narrative around my deception, attempting to shift the heavy burden of guilt from the perpetrator directly onto the victim. The defense attorney paced methodically before the jury box, utilizing every ounce of his extensive theatrical training to reshape the reality of the past year. He argued passionately that my decision to conceal my true identity as the chief executive officer of Apex Logistics was not a harmless test of character, but a cruel, calculated psychological trap. He painted a vivid, highly distorted picture of Kendra as a devoted, loving daughter crumbling under the immense pressure of a fabricated reality. According to his aggressive narrative, my strict insistence on living in a modest, working-class neighborhood and driving a rusted Ford pickup truck was a malicious form of emotional torture. He claimed I deliberately forced my daughter to carry the agonizing burden of a father she genuinely believed was rapidly sliding into poverty and eventual destitution. He argued that the crushing weight of this artificial financial crisis pushed Kendra into a state of profound mental panic. He explicitly stated that her subsequent actions, including the massive corporate embezzlement and the acquisition of fraudulent medical documents, were not born of unadulterated greed or social ambition. He categorized her felony crimes as desperate, misguided attempts to generate enough capital to secure my future medical care. He told the silent jury that no child could reasonably be expected to make rational legal decisions while being actively deceived by the patriarch of their own family. He weaponized my vast wealth against me, stating that a man possessing hundreds of millions of dollars who allowed his daughter to agonize over a simple $60,000 checking account was guilty of profound emotional abuse. He attempted to turn my silent observation into an active, malicious entrapment scheme. The attorney leaned heavily on the wooden jury rail, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, dramatic whisper. He suggested that I had actively engineered the exact conditions for her failure, simply to satisfy my own twisted corporate ego. He completely ignored the established fact that my wealth had never been a secret to Cynthia, who had always insisted we raise our child with the value of hard work rather than the toxic expectation of an endless inheritance. The attorney purposefully disregarded the lavish, debt-ridden lifestyle Kendra and Bradley had chosen to pursue independently. He focused entirely on the illusion of the desperate, broken daughter, trying to convince 12 ordinary citizens that a father's lie of omission legally justified grand larceny and severe elder exploitation. He wanted the jury to look at me and see a ruthless puppet master pulling the strings of a family tragedy I had personally authored. I remained perfectly silent and completely motionless in the wooden witness chair as the defense attorney finally concluded his venomous opening statement. I did not glare at him or physically react to the blatant character assassination unfolding before the federal judge. I simply turned my steady gaze toward the defense table and looked directly at Kendra. She was executing a masterful, highly rehearsed performance for the court. The designer emerald silk gown from the hotel gala had been entirely replaced by a conservative, unbranded beige blouse and a plain gray skirt. Her hair was pulled back tightly in a simple, unassuming style. She sat with her shoulders slumped heavily forward, clutching a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands. She wept softly, dabbing continuously at her dry eyes, projecting the exact image of a shattered, misunderstood woman, completely overwhelmed by a cruel, unforgiving world. She firmly refused to meet my eyes, keeping her gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood of the defense table. Bradley sat beside her, mirroring her defeated posture, staring blankly at his handcuffed wrists. I studied her theatrical display with the cold, sterile detachment of a corporate auditor reviewing a falsified ledger. There was absolutely no genuine remorse in her posture. There was only the terrifying realization of a cornered predator trying desperately to mimic a wounded prey. I thought about Cynthia in that quiet, heavy moment. My late wife had possessed a heart capable of infinite forgiveness, but she also possessed a fierce, unyielding demand for absolute personal accountability. Cynthia would have seen straight through this cheap beige blouse and these manufactured strategic tears. She would have instantly recognized the exact same ruthless arrogance that led our daughter to steal the very home we had built together. Kendra was relying entirely on the jury to feel profound pity, hoping that a few strategically placed tears would successfully wash away a $2 million embezzlement scheme and a forged medical commitment order. Jonathan stood up from the prosecutor's table with the steady, relentless calm of an incoming tidal wave. He did not immediately object or raise his voice to counter the emotional, fabricated narrative the defense had just vomited into the federal courtroom. He walked silently toward the center podium and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the court technician. The large digital evidence displays mounted on the courtroom walls flickered instantly to life. Jonathan did not use passionate rhetoric or emotional appeals to dismantle the defense attorney's argument. He used undeniable cold digital forensics. He projected a highly detailed, time-stamped log of encrypted computer access records directly onto the massive screens. He explicitly informed the presiding judge and the jury that the data displayed was extracted directly from the dark web by specialized federal cybercrime investigators. The digital records provided absolute, unassailable proof that Kendra had actively hired a professional hacker to breach the security protocols of my personal local bank account. Jonathan used a laser pointer to highlight the exact date of the initial cyber intrusion. The illegal hack occurred exactly 8 months prior to the disastrous housewarming party, long before my true identity as the CEO of Apex Logistics was ever revealed to her. The digital footprint definitively proved that her motive to steal my remaining $60,000 was not born out of sudden panic or confusion regarding my corporate secrecy. The malicious, calculated intent to strip her father of his last remaining assets had been meticulously planned and executed months in advance of any supposed psychological distress. The defense attorney's entire narrative of a confused, desperate daughter shattered instantly against the hard, unforgiving wall of digital truth. The meticulously constructed lie completely collapsed, sealing her fate in absolute certainty. The defense attorney, desperate to salvage his collapsing narrative after the digital forensics obliterated his timeline, played his final high-stakes card. He called Dr. Eris Thomas to the witness stand. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the distinguished physician walked down the center aisle with the practiced, authoritative stride of a man entirely accustomed to blind obedience. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, projecting an aura of absolute medical certainty. He placed his right hand firmly on the leather-bound Bible, swearing an oath to the court to tell the whole truth. He then sat in the witness chair, adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, and looked directly at the jury box with a practiced expression of deep clinical concern. Guided by the aggressive defense attorney, Dr. Thomas launched into a meticulously crafted psychiatric evaluation. He spoke with a smooth, commanding baritone voice, utilizing complex medical terminology to mask the absolute falsehood of his claims. He testified under oath that he had personally reviewed my behavioral history and conducted comprehensive assessments of my mental state. He declared to the federal judge and the 12 silent jurors that I was suffering from severe acute paranoid delusions coupled with rapid-onset neurodegeneration. He painted a terrifying picture of an elderly man who had completely lost his grip on reality, a man who perceived non-existent threats from his loving family due to the structural decay of his own brain. Dr. Thomas explicitly stated that my refusal to hand over my assets to Kendra was a direct, undeniable symptom of clinical paranoia. He concluded his testimony by insisting with grave professional urgency that I required immediate, involuntary psychiatric commitment to a secure medical facility for my own physical safety. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting flat against the polished oak surface. I did not glare at the man actively committing blatant perjury. I simply studied his face, feeling a cold, heavy stone settle deep within my chest. This was not merely a random corrupt physician Kendra and Bradley had hired from a dark corner of the internet. This was Dr. Eris Thomas, the primary care physician who had treated my family for over 15 years. He was the exact same man who had sat in my modest living room a decade ago, writing the specialized prescriptions that eased the agonizing pain of Cynthia's failing heart during her final months on this earth. I had trusted this man explicitly with the life of the woman I loved more than anything in the world. I had shaken his hand, thanked him for his compassionate care, and viewed him as a sacred, honorable pillar of our community. Seeing him now, utilizing his esteemed medical credentials to actively participate in a malicious conspiracy to destroy my life, demonstrated the terrifying absolute power of stolen corporate wealth. Bradley's embezzled money had not just bought a fake document, it had successfully purchased the total moral bankruptcy of a man sworn to heal. It was a profound, sickening betrayal that cut much deeper than Kendra's own greed. At the defense table, Kendra and Bradley visibly relaxed for the first time in days. Kendra sat up slightly straighter, a faint, hopeful smirk returning to the corners of her mouth. Bradley leaned back in his wooden chair, crossing his arms over his chest. They firmly believed that the unwavering authority of a respected medical professional would instantly overwrite Jonathan's digital evidence. They assumed the jury would naturally defer to the distinguished doctor sitting in the witness box, easily dismissing my independent neurological evaluations from the National Institute as the desperate actions of a wealthy, disturbed man. They thought they had finally successfully closed the trap, using a familiar face to deliver the lethal blow to my credibility. Jonathan stood up from the prosecutor's table with the steady, relentless calm of an incoming tidal wave. He did not possess the frantic, theatrical energy of the defense attorney. My chief legal counsel moved with slow, inevitable momentum. He approached the center podium holding a single, heavily classified manila folder. He did not immediately raise his voice or aggressively attack the doctor's medical conclusions. He started his cross-examination with polite surgical precision. He calmly asked Dr. Thomas to confirm his absolute impartiality in this case. The physician nodded confidently, stating for the official court record that his medical opinion was entirely objective and completely uninfluenced by any external financial factors. Jonathan accepted the answer with a slight knowing nod. He then opened the manila folder and extracted a single sheet of paper. He walked deliberately across the courtroom floor and placed the document face up on the wooden ledge directly in front of the witness chair. Jonathan stepped back and addressed the entire courtroom. He announced that the document he had just submitted into evidence was a decrypted, highly classified international wire transfer log obtained directly through federal subpoenas. He instructed Dr. Thomas to read the highlighted figures aloud. The physician lowered his eyes to the paper. The confident, authoritative aura surrounding him vanished in a fraction of a second. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw trembled silently. He absolutely refused to read the paper. Jonathan did not wait for his compliance. My lawyer turned to the jury and methodically broke down the undeniable financial timeline. He traced a massive singular wire transfer originating directly from Bradley's primary shell company. He detailed how the stolen corporate funds were routed through 2 separate offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to deliberately obscure the digital trail. Jonathan then revealed the final destination of that laundered money. The funds had landed perfectly into a hidden private banking account registered exclusively under the maiden name of Dr. Thomas's wife. Jonathan did not stop there. He possessed a ruthless commitment to total destruction. He read the exact dollar amount of the offshore transfer into the official court record. The figure echoed sharply through the silent room. It was not a random sum of money. The massive bribe perfectly matched the exact recently appraised market value of my suburban home. Kendra and Bradley had not just paid him a standard flat fee for a fake medical certificate. They had promised the corrupt doctor the total liquidated value of my real estate in exchange for his binding medical testimony locking me inside a psychiatric ward. They had essentially sold my house to the doctor before they had even legally stolen it from me. Dr. Thomas physically collapsed inward. He slumped forward in the wooden witness chair, heavy beads of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His hands shook violently as he gripped the edges of the stand. The defense attorney jumped to his feet, frantically shouting objections, desperately trying to strike the financial records from the record to save his crumbling case, but his voice was completely drowned out by the sheer magnitude of the exposed corruption. Dr. Thomas opened his mouth to formulate a defense to claim the money was a legitimate investment or a simple loan, but only a pathetic, choked stammer escaped his lips. He was completely paralyzed by the undeniable proof of his own criminality. The presiding federal judge had heard enough. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto his sound block with a deafening crack that silenced the entire room instantly. The judge's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He looked directly at the trembling physician and declared that the federal court would not tolerate blatant perjury or the malicious corruption of the legal system for financial gain. The judge barked a sharp definitive order to the armed federal marshals standing at the perimeter of the courtroom. He commanded them to take the witness into immediate custody. 2 heavily armed officers marched directly up to the witness stand. They grabbed Dr. Thomas by his tailored shoulders, hauled him roughly to his feet, and wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around the physician's wrists echoed clearly through the stunned courtroom. The gallery erupted into a wave of shocked, breathless whispers. I remained perfectly still, watching the marshals drag the disgraced, ruined doctor down the center aisle. I shifted my gaze back to the defense table. Kendra and Bradley were staring at the empty witness stand in absolute, paralyzing horror. Their final, most powerful line of defense had just been hauled away in chains right in front of their eyes. The impenetrable fortress of lies they had built with my stolen money was completely eradicated, leaving them utterly defenseless before the impending verdict. The heavy wooden door of the jury deliberation room clicked open after barely 3 hours. In the complex world of federal financial crimes and elder exploitation, such a rapid return usually signaled a catastrophic defeat for the defense. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened instantly. I sat perfectly still beside Jonathan, my posture reflecting the absolute certainty of a man who had already seen the final ledger. Kendra and Bradley stood rigidly at the defense table, their earlier theatrical arrogance completely replaced by a sickly, hollow terror. The jury foreperson handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it directly to the presiding judge. The judge reviewed the documents with a severe, uncompromising expression, ensuring every legal protocol was meticulously observed. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp rustle of the thick paper. He instructed the defendants to remain standing and ordered the jury foreperson to read the verdict aloud for the official court record. Count by count, the meticulously constructed empire of lies Kendra and Bradley had built completely disintegrated. They were found unequivocally guilty on every single federal indictment. The foreperson's voice remained steady and clear as she delivered guilty verdicts for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, international money laundering, and conspiracy to commit medical forgery. More damningly, the jury found them fully liable for the severe civil charges of elder abuse and witness intimidation. The comprehensive digital forensics, the undeniable financial routing numbers, and the shocking exposure of the corrupt physician had proven completely insurmountable. Their lavish lifestyle, entirely funded by stolen corporate capital and malicious fraud, was officially over. The judge did not hesitate to implement the immediate financial consequences. He formally ordered the total seizure of all their remaining assets to begin compensating Apex Logistics for the massive $2 million deficit. The sprawling suburban mansion where Kendra had arrogantly demanded I park my truck in the back alley was officially slated for federal foreclosure by the end of the month. The luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, and the offshore accounts were all permanently stripped away. They had attempted to steal my modest, sentimental home to fund their vanity. Now they were legally reduced to possessing absolutely nothing. The sentencing phase offered no leniency or judicial mercy. The federal judge looked down at Kendra and Bradley with profound disgust, condemning their actions as a sickening display of unadulterated greed and moral bankruptcy. He explicitly noted that their calculated attempt to forcefully institutionalize an active, highly capable chief executive officer using fabricated medical documents demonstrated a severe, unrepentant danger to society. He brought the heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a definitive ringing strike. The judge sentenced both Kendra Pierce and her husband to 15 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The harsh reality of the sentence physically buckled Bradley's knees, forcing the armed marshals to aggressively support his weight. Kendra did not collapse, but a deep, vacant shock settled permanently behind her eyes. The marshals stepped forward immediately, commanding the defendants to place their hands behind their backs. The metallic snap of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet courtroom, signaling the absolute end of their freedom. As the federal marshals forcefully marched them down the center aisle toward the holding cells, Kendra abruptly dug her heels into the carpet. She stopped directly parallel to the plaintiff's table, where I remained seated. The marshals tensed, preparing to physically drag her forward, but she ignored them. She turned her head and looked directly at me. The arrogant, calculating executive was gone, replaced entirely by a desperate, terrified inmate. She locked her tear-filled eyes onto mine and asked if I had ever truly considered her my daughter during my decade-long psychological test. She wanted to blame my corporate secrecy for her profound moral failure, desperately seeking one final shred of external validation to ease her crushing guilt. I did not soften my expression or offer any paternal comfort. I stood up slowly, ensuring I looked down at her from a position of absolute unyielding authority. I delivered my final response with a voice as cold and sharp as a freshly honed blade. I told her that I had fulfilled every single obligation of a devoted father by providing her with a flawless education, a secure foundation, and the powerful wings necessary to soar in the corporate world. I explicitly stated that her deliberate, malicious decision to use those wings to act like a scavenger, picking at what she perceived to be a dying carcass, was entirely her own choice. I commanded her to accept the agonizing price of her arrogance and serve her time. I did not wait for a response or a tearful apology. I turned my back to her completely and walked with measured, steady strides straight out of the heavy courtroom doors. I stepped into the bright, bustling hallway of the federal building, never once looking back at the wreckage of the woman who had tried to destroy me. The storm had finally broken, washing away the accumulated filth of an entire year and leaving behind a pristine, unyielding silence. I stood in the center of the executive suite at the pinnacle of the Apex Logistics headquarters. The heavy mahogany doors were closed, sealing out the frantic murmurs of the corporate world that had spent the last week digesting the spectacular downfall of my daughter. There was no lingering chaos in this room. The air was crisp, filtered, and entirely under my control. For 10 years, I had operated from the shadows, utilizing this heavily restricted office as a hidden command center to quietly steer the empire I had built. I had allowed the illusion of a passive, retired life to serve as a litmus test for my own flesh and blood. That test had concluded with a federal prison sentence. Now the heavy velvet curtains masking my authority were permanently drawn back. I walked around the massive desk and took my seat not as a silent shareholder, but as the active, undisputed chief executive officer. The polished wood beneath my hands felt cold and familiar. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a city that ran on the supply chains I controlled. The legal battle was completely finished. The federal marshals had processed Kendra and Bradley, securing them in distinct correctional facilities where their forged medical documents and stolen wealth held absolutely zero currency. The threat to my autonomy had been surgically excised. I opened the encrypted terminal on my desk. The screen glowed with the raw data of international logistics, global shipping routes, and quarterly projections. It was time to aggressively scrub the remaining infection from my company. I summoned Jonathan to the suite. My chief legal counsel entered with his usual measured stride, carrying a single digital tablet instead of the massive red dossiers that had defined our recent war. He placed the device on my desk with a sharp click. The screen displayed the complete organizational chart of the transportation department. It was covered in red flags. Kendra had not merely embezzled millions to fund her husband's fraudulent tech startup. She had actively cultivated a toxic ecosystem of loyal sycophants and complicit middle managers to shield her criminal activities from routine oversight. They were parasites feeding off the corporate host. I looked at Jonathan and issued a direct, uncompromising mandate. The era of passive observation was dead. It was time for a corporate execution. I initiated a comprehensive and ruthless purge of the entire corporate structure. I did not delegate this task to the Human Resources Department. I personally reviewed the employment files of every single executive and manager operating under the Transportation Division. Jonathan sat across from me, actively executing the termination protocols as I highlighted the names. We started with the department heads who had authorized the phantom freight invoices without questioning the fabricated routing numbers. I signed their immediate dismissal notices, stripping them of their severance packages due to gross negligence and complicity in federal fraud. Security personnel were dispatched simultaneously across 5 different floors of the headquarters. They escorted the corrupt executives out of the building with zero warning, confiscating their access badges and seizing their company-issued devices before they could delete a single email. Kendra had built her power base through intimidation, promoting individuals who possessed flexible morals and a willingness to look the other way. I systematically demolished that base in less than 3 hours. The corporate rot was entirely eradicated. With the toxic elements excised, I turned my attention to the foundation of the company. During my decade of silent observation, I had closely monitored the lower-level analysts and junior logistics coordinators. I had watched brilliant young minds propose highly efficient shipping algorithms only to have their work stolen, suppressed, or outright rejected by Kendra because they threatened her absolute control. I pulled up the personnel file of a 30-year-old logistics planner who had correctly flagged the budget anomalies 6 months ago, only to be formally reprimanded by Kendra for overstepping his authority. I instructed Jonathan to immediately promote him to the vacant position of Director of Transportation. I elevated a dozen other young dedicated professionals into senior management roles. I replaced loyalty bought with stolen money with authority earned through absolute merit and ethical integrity. I restructured the financial oversight committees, implementing aggressive new auditing protocols that required triple verification for any offshore vendor contracts. The blood of Apex Logistics was completely renewed by the end of the business day. The suffocating, corrupt culture my daughter had fostered was incinerated, replaced by a streamlined, highly functional meritocracy. I had not just saved my corporation from a devastating financial hemorrhage. I had actively forged it into a stronger, more resilient entity. The business was clean, the ledger was balanced, the internal war was definitively won. Late in the afternoon, the harsh sunlight reflecting off the glass skyscrapers began to soften into a deep, bruised orange. I closed the encrypted terminal and stood up from the executive desk. I put on my faded flannel jacket, feeling the rough, familiar texture against my shoulders. I rode the private elevator down to the subterranean parking garage, the mechanical hum of the descent serving as a quiet transition between my two worlds. I walked past the reserved spaces meant for luxury imported sedans and approached my old chipped blue Ford pickup truck. I opened the heavy metal door, climbed into the cab, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life with a steady, reliable vibration that no modern vehicle could replicate. I drove out of the underground facility and navigated through the dense, crawling city traffic. The drive back to the suburbs was a methodical journey away from the corporate battlefield and toward my personal sanctuary. I turned onto my quiet street and parked the truck in the driveway. I killed the engine and stepped out into the crisp evening air. I stood on the pavement and looked closely at my house. It was not a sprawling gated mansion like the one Kendra and Bradley had financed with my stolen capital. It was a modest single-story home with a weathered brick chimney and a meticulously maintained rose garden in the backyard. But to me, it was the most valuable fortress on earth. This was the exact house Cynthia and I had purchased with the very first profits from Apex Logistics. It was the physical manifestation of our shared sacrifices, our late-night struggles, and our unwavering devotion. Kendra had viewed this property as a convenient asset to liquidate a quick cash injection to cover a fraudulent loan. She had brought a predatory appraiser into my living room to put a price tag on Cynthia's memory. She had failed spectacularly. The house stood firm, completely intact, and entirely unencumbered by debt. It did not belong to a bank. It did not belong to a state-run nursing home. It belonged exclusively to me. I walked up the concrete path, the heavy work boots making a solid, grounded sound with every step. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was warm, carrying the faint, comforting scent of old wood and polished leather. The brass carriage clock Cynthia had given me rested safely on the mantel, ticking with absolute precision. I walked into the kitchen and moved with practiced, unhurried efficiency. I filled the percolator with dark roast coffee and listened to the rhythmic bubbling of the water. I poured the steaming black liquid into a thick ceramic mug. I carried the mug out through the back door and stepped onto the wooden porch. I sat down heavily in the old wooden rocking chair, feeling the familiar creak of the joints as I settled my weight into it. I looked out over the backyard. The sky had shifted into a deep, bruised purple, the final light of the sunset bleeding away into a quiet, absolute darkness. The silence of the evening was profound and entirely welcome. There were no more urgent, demanding phone calls threatening my independence. There were no more arrogant home invasions or forged medical documents waiting in the mail. There was no more exhausting pretense, no more biting my tongue while arrogance paraded as superiority. The agonizing charade was permanently over. I pictured Kendra and Bradley sitting in their respective sterile concrete cells wearing standard-issue jumpsuits, stripped entirely of their designer clothes and their stolen prestige. They had gambled their freedom on the false assumption that an older man was a helpless target. They had received their precise mathematical return on that investment. 15 years of cold, hard reality awaited them. My wealth was completely secure. My dignity was utterly uncompromised. My legacy was protected by layers of impenetrable legal and corporate steel. I brought the ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. The heat grounded me perfectly in the present moment. A new order had been decisively established, paid for with calculated patience, and executed with flawless precision. Everything had finally returned to its proper rightful place, permanently. Looking back at the shattered remnants of Kendra's ambition, I understood a harsh but necessary reality. Money is nothing more than a ruthless amplifier of human character. I built my corporate empire hoping to provide a foundation of unbreakable security, but unearned privilege only bred a catastrophic entitlement. True wealth is never measured by executive titles, luxury suburban estates, or offshore bank accounts. It is entirely defined by the basic human dignity we extend to others when we falsely believe we have absolutely nothing to gain from them. Greed will always meticulously construct its own inescapable prison. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more powerful life lessons, and share your thoughts in the comments section below.